Happy Halloween, and welcome back to Pathfinder. My name is Philip, and I'm here to talk about Pathfinder 2nd Edition. This is part of a series I am producing covering the various NPCs and factions in the Pathfinder role-playing game and its setting, the world of Golarion. This video marks a few firsts for my channel, my first ever holiday special, and my first ever feature-length video. Today, I'll be concluding my spooky theme for October with a discussion of someone who strikes fear into the hearts of the citizens of all of Avestan, Tar-Baphon, the Whispering Tyrant. I'll also be covering the Whispering Way, the mysterious cult from which he emerged and which is still active and dangerous on Golarion today, as well as its major members outside of the Tyrant himself. Buckle up. You've seen the runtime of this video. It's a doozy. Also, the topics of this video cover an extremely long time span, so I've put together a very basic visual timeline for you to follow along. If you're interested, check it out in the description, and be sure to let me know if it's a useful feature. Before that though, if you enjoy this video and want to hear more Pathfinder lore, consider subscribing or commenting below. Lastly, spoiler warning. To properly cover the Whispering Way and Tar-Baphon, I will need to spoil a couple first edition adventure paths. Both Carrion Crown and Tyrant's Grasp heavily feature the machinations of today's subjects, so each of these products will be spoiled in some pretty big ways. With that out of the way, let's move on to the history and beliefs of the Whispering Way. The Whispering Way has existed for millennia in the shadows, and indeed, the organization's origins can be tracked all the way to the last time Shadow covered the whole of Golarion, the Age of Darkness. According to the Way's own oral tradition, the organization was first founded after the Earthfall calamity and the collapse of Aslant and Thassalon. The specifics of the organization's founding are unclear, though it's possible that these details are known by the most learned members of the Way and are simply kept a secret. Most scholars of the subject on Golarion seem to agree that the Whispering Way likely began as an informal network of like-minded necromancers working with their students and enslaved thralls to preserve and explore the science and philosophy of undeath. These necromancers likely drew upon the religious and arcane practices from pre-Earthfall societies, including the gluttonous sin mages of Gastash in Thassalon and the cults of Urgathoa or Zura who were well established in Aslant and beyond. Over time, these semi-independent cells of necromancers slowly converged on a set of shared beliefs and practices, which eventually formed the basis of the modern Whispering Way. But what specifically are these beliefs? To cut straight to the heart of it, the Whispering Way teaches that undeath is the pinnacle of existence, the perfect and most logical evolution of life, which exists in pristine, ordered harmony with its environment. To the adherents of the Whispering Way, life, by which I mean mortal life, is seen as a wasteful and inefficient detour which all beings are forced to take on their passage through existence. Unlife, the forceful sustainment of existence through the animating forces of void energy, is seen as the superior path. To support this argument, the necromancers of the Way cite the many efficiencies undeath provides. No need, or at least severely reduced need, for food, the absence of pain, and resistance or outright immunity to disease and other bodily weaknesses. Additionally, the Way professes the benefits of the long lifespans, so to speak, which unlife provides, offering practitioners the unparalleled opportunity to plan in the very long term, and invest in the future of not only themselves, but their communities. Adherents of the Way often see undeath as the only reasonable path to take in an otherwise unreasonable world. This emphasis on cold logic and reason is very much a feature of the Whispering Way's philosophy. They teach that unlife is the logical answer to the complex challenges posed by mortal life, challenges of limited resources, short-term versus long-term planning, and conflicting interests between disparate groups due to unequal power and diverse perspectives. By embracing unlife, these questions, or at least many of them, disappear or become infinitely more manageable. The Whispering Way approaches these problems as an equation, one for which undeath is the known variable which zeroes out most of the complexity. And in believing that they have found the logical answer to life's problems, the adherents of the Way see themselves as exceptionally intelligent in a world of idiocy and senselessness. This pride in their own intellect and logic has naturally led to the elevation of one particular type of undead among all others within their ranks, the Lich. Liches are among the most powerful of the major designations of undead, and are defined by two main factors: the presence and power of their soul cage, and the complexity required of their transformation into a Lich. While it is well known that all soul cages are unique to their respective Lich, what is less known is that the methods by which a person becomes a Lich are equally unique. No two Liches throughout history have ever been created in exactly the same way. The process of becoming a Lich is both highly academic and tremendously personal, involving a deep understanding of one's own soul, as well as technical mastery of necromantic magic and complex arcane, divine, or occult formulae. The process is also incredibly dangerous, and even a single minor mistake can result in disastrous and deadly consequences. Due to the technical complexity involved in their creation, Liches are championed as the mightiest and most intelligent members of the Whispering Way, and becoming a Lich is seen as the ultimate goal of all living members of the Order. To that end, one of the greatest secrets of the Order is the Way in the name Whispering Way. While the word Way is often understood to mean the organization's particular philosophy through which they view the world, it also refers to a secret method of achieving lichdom which has passed through the Order since its founding. This formula for the creation of a Lich provides practitioners with the building blocks for the technical mastery aspect of the process, though it is up to each individual practitioner to understand the formula's many complexities and technicalities, and to come to their own understanding of the depths of their soul. While I am discussing the origins of the Order's name, I would be remiss if I didn't explain the whispering part of the moniker as well. Much like the word way, the adverb whispering has a dual meaning. In a symbolic sense, the phrase reflects the Order's nature as a secret society, which exists in the shadows and must operate out of sight for fear of being hunted. Whispering does, however, have another meaning, one which is far more literal. The teachings of the Whispering Way can never be written down, under any circumstances. They must be passed from member to member verbally, whispered quietly from master to student. The Whispering Way maintains no libraries on its teachings, and members are forbidden from maintaining any written records of their necromantic experiments, or the deeper secrets of the philosophy. This type of information can only ever be passed via oral tradition, and the most accomplished members of the Order are often those who have the best and most reliable memories. Now, I don't mean to imply that agents of the Way don't make use of the written word. They absolutely do. Wizards in the Way still maintain spellbooks, and members are often adept at infiltrating and navigating libraries of magical knowledge. Some degree of writing is permitted among members, but these writings are strictly forbidden from containing any information pertaining to the Way's operations, or the deeper necromantic secrets the cult has discovered. On the rare occasions such forbidden texts are produced, members of the Way make it a top priority to locate and destroy the text in question, with the book's author not being far behind. As you might expect, this emphasis on secrecy makes defectors incredibly rare, and those few individuals who do seek to escape often find themselves relegated to a life of hiding in some nondescript corner of the world. Some members have even found their very souls corrupted to the point that they disintegrate into dust if they abandon the Order's teachings. While the Whispering Way maintains this level of secrecy for many reasons, one of the most obvious is the nature of their ultimate goal. While individual members of the Whispering Way generally have the personal goal of achieving lichdom, the organization as a whole does have a collective goal: the complete and total death of Golarion. The organization's view that mortal life is by its nature inefficient and flawed leads to this logical conclusion, and so the Way seeks nothing less than the elimination of all living things from Golarion, so that undeath can rule. The members of the Way seek to build what they see as a utopia, a world populated only by the dead, which exists in perfect natural order under the watchful eyes of the mightiest and most knowledgeable undead lords. It goes without saying, of course, that these undead lords would be the highest-ranking members of the Way itself. Now, because this is my video, and I make no claims about being impartial, this is the part where I get to editorialize and inform you that the Whispering Way is completely full of shit. They can make all the claims they want about living in harmony with the world and solving the problems of limited resources and bringing about lasting peace through undeath. None of it is true. It is all lies. While there are certainly some members of the Way who believe them, these higher ideals are a delusion. In truth, the Whispering Way is all about power. Adherents of the Way use the organization to increase their own personal power to ensure their own success in the world and advance their own private agendas. To the degree that they do work toward a common goal, they generally do so for one of two reasons. They can't get what they want on their own, or they are afraid to disobey their superiors. Rivalries are common among the adherents of the Order, and members see no problem with killing their fellows, so long as it doesn't violate the orders from their direct superiors. Beyond the general internal rivalries and selfishness on the part of individual members, many of the broader goals espoused by the wider organization are riddled with hypocrisy. The order they seek is one of complete domination, and the peace they seek to bring about is one maintained through fear of overwhelming force. At the same time, the harmony they seek to achieve with the environment is hardly as natural as they claim. While some forms of undeath, like ghosts, might be described as naturally occurring, most of them, and especially the liches which the Way celebrates above all others, are far from naturally occurring, and must be actively created through tremendous effort. At the same time, the efforts of the Whispering Way in the Age of Lost Omens can hardly be considered harmonious with the world around them. Massive construction efforts, like the Tower of Gallowspire or the infamous Wizard King's Pit, have had disastrous consequences on the environment and have caused untold suffering and death. The only way in which the cult's efforts could in any way be considered harmonious with the wider world is if you discount the suffering, enslavement, and death of living beings, something which the Whispering Way is all too enthusiastic to do. In short, they are tyrants. Villains who see themselves as superior to all other beings by virtue of their intellect and the power they've accumulated. For all their bluster and rhetoric, their motivation is entirely selfish and despotic. They seek to destroy all life so they might rule over the ashes, and their justification for doing so is nothing more than their belief that they are superior to others. They can't be reasoned with and can't be defeated through logic or argument. They are about as unsympathetic as villains get. Though I don't doubt that there are a few members who have fallen for the rhetoric and fully believe that they are doing something noble. In short, the Whispering Way is a disease, a philosophical blight upon the land, which must be scoured away in its totality. Alright, rant over. Now back to the lore. While the Whispering Way passes its knowledge through a complex oral tradition, vanishingly few members have a complete grasp of the organization's full body of knowledge. Outside of the most powerful and senior members of the Order, I doubt anyone maintains a grasp on all the Order's secrets. This is, in part, due to the inherent complexity of the Way's lore, teachings, and history. The amount of information to be learned necessitates an incredibly long period of study, so only long-lasting undead are likely to have the opportunity to master the knowledge the cult has collected. Another factor in this limited information spread is the aforementioned internal rivalries between members. As followers of the Way seek to advance their own power and understanding, they often seek to undermine the efforts of their rivals by restricting information to those they believe are loyal or useful. These factors have led to an organizational structure which consists of numerous independent cells of followers organized into hyper-specialized areas of focus. These areas might include the study of specific kinds of undead, or perhaps the destruction or infiltration of specific organizations opposed to the Way. Individual cells rarely maintain close ties with one another, and are generally coordinated only at the high level by their direct superiors. This loose structure has several advantages, not the least of which is the defense it provides against outsiders. The Whispering Way has many enemies, and if any one cell is infiltrated or destroyed, the broader organization has little in the way of exposure or risk. Any cell can be cut off or jettisoned at any time to protect the rest of the order with relative ease, and without losing much in the way of organizational power or operational capacity. There is, however, a problem presented by this structure. If, by some chance, the leadership of the Whispering Way could be eliminated or cut off from their subordinates, then individual cells would lack the capacity or experience to coordinate on a large scale. Under these circumstances, individual cells and the knowledge in which they specialized would be vulnerable. Taking out a whole cell within the Way could then become an effective means of reducing the organization's total necromantic knowledge, in addition to its operational capacity. If you've ever worked in a company which relies heavily on tribal knowledge held by a few key employees, then those employees retire or leave, you'll know the type of vulnerability I'm talking about. The information silos which form within the Order, and the relatively small number of individuals who fully understand everything the Order studies, presents a tempting opportunity for enemies to meaningfully reduce the organization's shared knowledge base. Before I wrap up this section, I should discuss the importance of religion to the Whispering Way. While the Whispering Way is a philosophy all its own, it is not incompatible with more conventional religion, and cults devoted to deities of undeath are often closely connected to the Way throughout the Inner Sea region and on broader Golarion. Urgathoa is the most prominent deity worshipped among the members of the Whispering Way, but she is hardly the only one. Other gods of undeath or necromancy, like Zura, Cabriri, Orcus, or Fumeoshi, are popular as well, and Zon-Kuthon and Mahathala might be popular too. Most of these deities are worshipped only in secret throughout much of the world, meaning their faiths already tend toward cultism, giving them substantial overlap with the behavior of the Whispering Way. Some cults to these deities exist entirely within the Whispering Way, and are populated exclusively by its members. Other cults might be secretly infiltrated, or even led by members of the Way, who seek to commandeer the cult's actions, or use the cult as a recruiting ground. Not all members of the Way are religious, however, and more than a few see faith as nothing more than a useful tool to advance their broader agenda. Finally, I want to jump back to the history of the Whispering Way prior to the Age of Enthronement. So much of the Order's known history is wrapped up in the antics of Tar-Baphon, but there is one major event in their history which is widely known and which predates his rise. Vampires are a common enough threat on Golarion in the Age of Lost Omens, but this wasn't always the case. The blood-sucking children of the night are not native to Golarion, and their arrival is understood by many to be attributed to the Whispering Way. The exact date of this event is unclear, but the Whispering Way claims that one of its members once opened a portal to the Netherworld, allowing the first vampires to bleed onto Golarion and the material plane. These first vampires were the Strigoi, a subspecies of vampire which no longer exists, but which slowly evolved over the generations into the known species of vampires on Golarion today, including the Moroi, the Nosferatu, the Jiangshi, the Vrikolakas, and the Vetala, or Vetelarana. And that concludes everything we know about the Whispering Way prior to the rise of Tar-Baphon, whose power brought the cult out of the shadows and onto the world stage. The Rise and Fall of Tar-Baphon. While the Whispering Way had been hunted since its founding in the Age of Darkness, the Order had managed to remain largely unnoticed by the major power players in Golarion for most of its existence. While many factors contributed to this, the most important for our discussion was the lack of a unifying leader among their ranks. Throughout the Order's history, no necromancer existed who was singularly powerful enough to command the loyalty of the entire organization and unify their efforts. This all came to an end in the Age of Enthronement with the rise of Tar-Baphon. This necromancer, who would eventually take on the title of the Whispering Tyrant, would go on to become the champion of the Way, and its most powerful and influential member by a wide margin. Under the leadership of the Whispering Tyrant, the Whispering Way would surge to prominence in the geopolitics of Avestan, and would go from operating in the shadows to actively and publicly controlling huge swaths of territory. Before he became the Tyrant, before he was even a necromancer, Tar-Baphon was merely a man. Relatively little is known about Tar-Baphon's past prior to his ascension to power, but a few facts are well established. Tar-Baphon was born in 837 AR, somewhere on the northern shore of Lake Carthen. Born to the native Kelid peoples of the region, Tar-Baphon was raised into a life of relative comfort. He has been referred to as a prince by some sources, while others are less specific and imply that his family was merely wealthy or vaguely noble. As a young man, Tar-Baphon displayed a strong interest in and impressive talent for the necromantic arts. At some point during his studies, he developed a fascination with the arcane secrets of ancient Thassalon, and specifically with the practices of the necromantic rune lords of gluttony in long-lost Gastache. At this time, he was not associated with the Whispering Way, and his studies were independent. This would not remain the case, however, and he soon drew the Way's attention. Tar-Baphon became immersed in the secrets of the Whispering Way and quickly climbed through their ranks. While he wasn't yet a supreme leader, he could easily be thought of as a rising star within the Order during this period. One of the ways in which Tar-Baphon displayed his incredible power, and perhaps signaled to the world where he was headed, was his conquest of the city of Kestrelon in 861 AR. Located on Intipar Isle in the center of Lake Carthen, Kestrelon was a wealthy city under the rule of Sarkoris. The city played host to the Golden Solidarity, a splinter sect of the Prophecies of Calistrate which focused on the funding of charity as a means of obtaining personal glory, and thus metaphorical immortality. As a result of the Golden Society's actions, Kestrelon had become an exceptionally prosperous city for its size, and this free-flowing wealth drew the eye of Tar-Baphon. At the age of 24, the necromancer landed on Intipar Isle with an army of undead minions under his command. Tar-Baphon stormed the city, hurling his forces against the walls and reducing the fortress which protected the city's gates to rubble in an awesome display of arcane power. After his conquest was complete, the wizard gathered the corpses of the city's defenders and nailed them to the walls of the city. Through some unknown wicked magic, these corpses still remain nailed to the walls, a grim reminder to all those who see them of the wrath of Tar-Baphon. With the city firmly under his control, the necromancer saw fit to give it a new name. He dubbed it Xin-Grafar, using the prefix Xin from the ancient Thessalonian naming customs, and combining it with Grafar, the name of the city's fallen citadel, as one last insult to those he conquered. Tar-Baphon then transported his own private treasure hoards, which were already sizable, to the island, and combined them with the wealth he had stolen from the city's inhabitants. His fortune secure, he quickly redoubled his efforts on necromantic study, setting himself to the unending task of nurturing his own dark powers. One of the ways he went about advancing his power was through a collaboration with an unexpected ally. Kothos of Mekhitar had been a loyal advisor to King Geb of Geb prior to the monarch's self-inflicted demise. Before Geb returned as a ghost, Kothos raided his king's treasury and stole a powerful artifact, a scroll called the Key of Geb. This scroll contained ancient knowledge, which some claimed traced back as far as Gormuz or even Asmodeus himself. This knowledge focused on the tearing down of barriers, and specifically the barriers protecting reality. Things like the borders between the planes, the barriers between life and death, and maybe even the barriers of the Dead Vault, the prison where Rovagug sleeps. Kothos of Mekhitar was no mere scholar of magic, however. He sought to use the Key of Geb. His nihilistic goal was simple: the end of everything. the absolute chaotic end of all forms of existence. In meeting Tar-Baphon, Kothos was sure he had met a powerful tool to make that dream a reality. Tar-Baphon likely had little interest in Kothos's ultimate goal, as his primary motivation still seemed to be the domination of an undead world, but he certainly saw the Key of Geb as a useful tool, and it greatly aided in the expansion of his power. Thus, Kothos became a trusted servant of Tar-Baphon, with each necromancer counting on their own usefulness to the other to ensure their continued cooperation. As Tar-Baphon set about consolidating power on Inteeper Isle, he discovered something unexpected and truly fascinating. A nearby thinness in reality, one which, oddly, bathed the whole island in a minuscule dose of negative energy. Curious, the necromancer began exploring the island in 872 AR, searching for the source of this negative aura. This led him from Xin-Grafar into the island's interior, well within the territory of the black dragon Caramoros, who claimed the uninhabited portions of the islands as hers to control with her mighty children. Caramoros proved a stubborn negotiator, and repeatedly refused Tar-Baphon access to the island's interior. Not yet powerful enough to challenge the dragon matriarch openly, Tar-Baphon was forced to wait, instead negotiating with her son Istravek and her daughter Naraga. Here he had more success, and both young dragons were more than willing to serve Tar-Baphon for the right price. Unfortunately, the two children had no idea what they had signed up for. Not long after this, Istravek was wounded in Tar-Baphon's service, though the specifics of this incident are unclear. In recompense for endangering her son, Caramoros took out her anger on one of Tar-Baphon's structures on the island, destroying it entirely. This display of wrath and power, however, would prove to be a mistake. Tar-Baphon witnessed Caramoros's rage and realized that he now held the keys to her heart, her beloved children. The necromancer imprisoned the draconic siblings and tore several scales from their flesh. He threw these scales at Caramoros's feet, demanding that she allow him free reign of the island, threatening to torture her children if she refused. Bound by the love of her children, Caramoros agreed, though the hatred festered in her heart, and she took a keen interest in freeing her offspring and stopping the necromancer's efforts. Now free to explore Inteeper Isle, Tar-Baphon began his hunt for the source of the strange negative aura which he felt. The extent of his discoveries would eventually prove monumental, but the specifics of what he discovered and when have been lost to time. But he eventually found himself incapable of progressing further in his studies with his existing expertise. He needed to advance his necromantic understanding further before his work could continue. So he began to seek out new sources of knowledge. This search eventually led him back to his obsession with ancient Thassalon and the rune lords of gluttony. In 880 AR, Tar-Baphon traveled to the Cenotaph, a Thessalonian site in eastern Belkzen. The Cenotaph was a construction of the infamous Lich rune lord Zutha, the last lord of gluttony in the nation of Gastash, and was built to serve as the immense mausoleum for his corpse while he awaited the opportunity to return his physical form to active function on Golarion. The structure itself consists of a towering pillar of undecorated black stone, set with a pair of huge stone doorways made from nokwal. The lower set of doors leads into the cenotaph itself, while the upper set of doors leads directly into the void. This connection to the void bathes the whole structure in void energy, previously called negative energy, which sustains the legions of undead soldiers which Zutha housed inside. And, importantly for this story, this negative energy affiliation was reminiscent of the aura which Tar-Baphon felt on Inteeper Isle. What specifically Tar-Baphon accomplished after he entered the cenotaph is unclear, though it is clear that he sought to unravel the mysteries of Zutha's most powerful magic. We know from several sources that he did not steal Zutha's most powerful artifacts, his rings, Aeon Stones, or Scythe, and also did not reform the Rune Lord's broken soul cage. There are rumors on Golarion that Tar-Baphon might have battled some incarnation of Zutha within the bowels of the cenotaph, though he would have almost certainly needed to possess one of the three pieces of Zutha's soul cage to have done so. Other sources claim that Tar-Baphon marched his own legions into the structure, though they never emerged with him afterwards. These sources claim that these legions await the tyrant's return, and will march upon the world the moment their king commands them. This suspicion is contradicted somewhat by other accounts of the cenotaph's interior, but the authenticity of those accounts to the current Pathfinder canon is unclear. What is clear is that Tar-Baphon gained what he was looking for. The visit to the cenotaph is where Tar-Baphon first achieved mythic power, propelling him from regional threat into living legend. His understanding of necromancy was forever changed, enabling the next major step in his long-term plan, the preparation for his transformation into a Lich. Emboldened by his success, Tar-Baphon returned to Intiper Isle in 881 AR and continued his explorations of the negative aura which he had first felt nearly a decade ago. This exploration quickly evolved into excavation, as he discovered the source of the dark emanation was hidden deep underground. Thus began the construction of the Wizard King's Pit, a hole which bored deep into the ground, some say as far as Sekamina in the Darklands. Once he reached the thinnest point between the planes, Tar-Baphon entered the pit and worked his terrible magic to tear open a rift in reality, creating a permanent portal to the void, the source of all void energy in the great beyond. I couldn't find any confirmation of this, but I suspect the knowledge contained within the Key of Geb was a major contributor to this act. To understand the extent of what he had done, Tar-Baphon unleashed one of his most powerful servants, Istravek, the son of Karamoros. The young dragon had been transformed by the necromancer's magic into a ravener, a type of undead dragon who feeds upon souls. Karamoros, who had been observing the necromancer's progress with the pit, flew into a rage upon seeing what remained of her son. She attacked Tar-Baphon, but was stopped by the sudden interference of her own daughter, Naraga, who had also been transformed into a ravener. Naraga tackled her mother into the pit, and the pair of dragons fell together into the void. Only Naraga emerged from the portal, though her victory was short-lived. She presented herself to Tar-Baphon, who rewarded her loyalty with betrayal. The necromancer annihilated her, then took her horns and incorporated them into a new artifact called the Horns of Naraga, which he wears as his personal helm to this day. Istravek remained by Tar-Baphon's side, and was one of his most loyal servants for centuries to come. With the death of Karamoros, Intiper Isle effectively fell under the control of Tar-Baphon, and he used this position of power to bestow upon it a new moniker, the Isle of Terror. By now, the Wizard King was well and truly regarded as the champion of the Whispering Way, and most of the cultists were drawn to his service and his growing kingdom. Speaking of which, with his power well and truly consolidated, Tar-Baphon began his conquest of the regions around Lake Encarthen. He raised enormous legions of undead soldiers, and called hordes of orcs to his side to augment his own forces. His very public goal was the conquest of all of Avestan, and for some time it appeared that he might be capable of achieving it. But, of course, this planned conquest would never come to fruition. Tar-Baphon's actions on the world stage eventually drew the attention of Eroden, the living god of humanity. Eroden had been alive for thousands of years at this point, and had witnessed the tyranny of the Rune Lords in ancient Thassalon at the height of their power. The living god saw in Tar-Baphon an echo of the Rune Lord's cruelty and viciousness, and took it upon himself to put an end to the necromancer's rise. But Tar-Baphon was not unaware of this challenge to his ascent. Indeed, some sources claim that the necromancer saw himself as a direct challenge to Eroden, a refutation of Eroden's claim as the mightiest human, and the only archwizard worthy of divinity. By these accounts, Tar-Baphon saw Eroden's rise to divinity as inherently unfair, as he only did so by absorbing the power of the Starstone, and sought to unseat and destroy him as a result. To that end, the necromancer began construction on a trap. This was the Well of Sorrows, an ornately decorated dungeon complex within the Wizard King's Pit, which stretched into the bowels of the Darklands. Tar-Baphon's plan was apparently to lure Erodin into the Well of Sorrows, whereupon the living god might be defeated. I say apparently because, at least by all accounts, this plan never came to fruition. In 896 AR, Erodin personally confronted Tar-Baphon on the Isle of Terror. Their battle was truly titanic, but the outcome was never really in question. One combatant was a man, while the other was a god, and nothing Tar-Baphon could do could overcome that gap. In the end, Tar-Baphon lay dead upon the ground, and Erodin, the living god, stood victorious. Erodin buried his rival's body on the Isle of Terror, then departed for Absalom once again. Tar-Baphon's remains would not stay on the isle for long, however, as his loyal followers among the Whispering Way soon uncovered them and took them back to Ustalav for a burial in accordance with his wishes. And, for over 2,000 years, this was the end of the story of Tar-Baphon. He had achieved much in his 59 years on Golarion, and his efforts on the Isle of Terror left a permanent scar upon the land. The Isle of Terror and Xin-Grafar. Before I continue our tale, I want to take a few minutes to describe the Isle of Terror in a bit more detail. The Isle of Terror is about as close to a literal blighted hellscape as exists on Golarion, and for a planet like Golarion, that's saying a lot. The tear in reality, which Tar-Baphon created, is still open, bathing the whole island in void energy. This energy is not consistent, however, but rather waxes and wanes at unpredictable intervals, flaring up in deadly void storms. These storms are a bizarre sight to behold, taking the form of distorted, two-dimensional planar projections of dark energy, which gives the whole island the appearance of having a low, black ceiling. These storms rain down bolts of negative energy in a manner similar to lightning, though these bolts pose no danger to undead beings. The surges in storm activity can last for weeks at a time, but are inherently unpredictable. The frequent surges of negative energy have wreaked havoc upon the landscape, rendering entire swaths of land dead or fallow. The three major forests on the island are excellent examples of this. The first, known only as Shadow's Heart, is a place where the trees themselves have absorbed the inherent malevolence of the void. These plants possess a primal and animalistic intelligence, and are possessed of a powerful but unfocused hatred. They lash out at all who enter their domain, dropping branches, whipping vines, or carrying off unsuspecting travelers in the night. The second forest, the Whitewood, is less immediately dangerous, at least on first glance. The plant life in the Whitewood is not sentient, but all of it, from the oldest tree to the youngest sapling, has been bleached bone white by some unknown force. While these woods are less malicious, the forest remains unexplored, as no one who's ever sought to unravel the forest's secrets, which might go as far back as ancient Aslant, has ever returned. The third haunted woodland of note is the Lingerlost Swamp, a mangrove swamp with a canopy so thick that daylight rarely reaches the surface of the water. Quicksand is a known danger, and thick brambles block all but the most concerted efforts at entry. Another example of the corruption of the land are the island's major waterways. The Whispering River flows from the island's center over a cliff, forming Baphon's Fall. There, the waters pool into the Whispering Lake, before flowing off toward the Lingerlost Swamp and eventually mingling with the waters of Lake Encarthen. Both the river and lake are highly poisonous, infused with the dangers of the void, dealing void damage to any who drink them or submerge themselves within. Few beings live along these waters, but the whisper-scale lizard folk are the exception. Their tough hides have adapted to the harsh waters and have turned black, making them even more well adapted to the constant darkness which the island experiences. Near the island's center are the Three Furies, a small mountain range dominated by three central peaks. Each of the three mountains climbs above the low-hanging planar void storms on the island, presenting a disarming view to those who crest the peaks. Between the three peaks lies something unexpected, a beautiful grove of trees, seemingly bathed in sunlight. At the center of this grove is the Wizard King's Pit, the gaping maw which Tar-Baphon dug into the earth, and from the pit erupts a maelstrom of dark energy. This is the energy which feeds the storms, and it swirls violently in the sky between the peaks. The surrounding grove of trees might appear idyllic from a distance, but it is actually filled with some of the most terrifying creatures on the whole of the island. From the Wizard King's pit will occasionally spew a semi-solid mass of dark energy, which will coalesce on the surface of the island, blanketing entire fields or hills. This blob-like mass is typically referred to simply as the Void, though for clarity I will be referring to it as the localized void. The area within the localized void takes on the planar properties of the void proper, meaning the negative energy plane. This area becomes bathed in high concentrations of void energy, destroying all living things and empowering the undead. Within the area, geography and one's surroundings lose all meaning, and someone inside experiences only the infinite blackness of the void. The localized void can apparently move or slowly dissipate, but new iterations can erupt from the Wizard King's pit at any time. There are two relevant settlements or structures on the Isle of Terror. The first is Fort Landing, the ruins of some long-abandoned fortress whose history has been long forgotten. The fort itself is a veritable maze of ivy-encrusted stonework, with the remains of a collapsed tower at the center. This fort overlooks the most prominent landing area on the island's otherwise rocky shore, a beach of soft white sand which can blow into immense dunes under the region's strong winds. This beach is almost certainly where any sizable invasion force would need to land on the Isle of Terror, a fact well known to both Tar-Baphon and his enemies. The other prominent structure is none other than Xin-Grafar itself, the Wizard King's own city and treasure hold. Xin-Grafar exists entirely underground, and can only be accessed by a single massive gate on the surface, hundreds of feet above the main city structure. The city proper consists of 3 districts, which take the form of tiered concentric rings in one large underground cavity. The districts, called the first, second, and third rings, are separated by immense stone walls, which run from floor to ceiling, physically cutting off each district from the others, and making each one technically a separate chamber. Running through all 3 districts are the most distinguishing features of the city, the molten gold canals. These canals are just what they sound like, manufactured rivers of molten gold which flow from Tar-Baphon's treasure chamber at the center of the city. While these canals are fantastic feats of engineering and tremendous displays of wealth, they also serve a practical purpose. When an intruder enters the city without Tar-Baphon's permission, a trap is triggered. The doors to the city seal shut, and the canals are rapidly flooded, filling huge segments of the underground chambers with incredibly hot molten gold. When the flood of gold finally recedes, it leaves behind a coating of gold leaf on all the surfaces in the city, up to a certain elevation, which marks the high watermark, so to speak, of the gold flood. This high watermark is well above the structures in the lowest first ring, while many of the structures in the second ring have roofs or upper floors which exist above the mark, and are therefore only partially coated in gold leaf. While the first ring of Xin-Grafar is largely in ruins, the second ring holds a fortune of almost incalculable size. The buildings of the second ring, and specifically the upper floors of these buildings, are filled with Tar-Baphon's personal treasure hoard. More coins and jewels than could ever be counted, vast collections of art, magic items of all types and levels of power, and any number of other things which the necromancer collected in his long and terrible career. This is undoubtedly one of the greatest treasure hoards in all of Golarion, on par, at least in terms of sheer monetary value, with the collections of emperors, kings, and archmages the world over. And yet, the contents of the second ring pale in comparison to what lies further in. At the very center of the city is the third ring, home to one of Tar-Baphon's greatest treasures. This ring contains many structures, but at the very center, surrounded by a circular canal of molten gold, is a tabernacle, and within the tabernacle is the Jewel of Everlasting Gold. And let me just take a moment to say, I would not be surprised if this structure was renamed in the future. The term tabernacle is most often, though not exclusively, associated specifically with Judaism and the tabernacle of the Israelites. I could see Paizo renaming this structure in the future, in the same way they renamed phylacteries to soul cages due to the real-world religious significance of phylacteries within modern Judaism, and especially Orthodox Judaism. Alright, minor note out of the way, back to the lore. The Jewel of Everlasting Gold is a phenomenally powerful artifact created by Tar-Baphon to be the centerpiece of his personal collection. The jewel itself is a ruby about the size of an apple, and it is set into an ornately decorated scepter of platinum, which is carved with magical runes. The jewel has an innate connection to the elemental plane of Earth, and is capable of drawing huge amounts of wealth from that plane in the form of gold, jewels, or other precious metals or materials. This summoning ability is the origin of the molten gold, which flows through the canals of the city, as well as the additional gold which floods the city when intruders are detected. The jewel does have additional powers, but the most relevant of them for our discussion is its ability to control all the wealth within Xin-Grafar, and prevent its removal from the city by anyone other than Tar-Baphon himself. All treasure produced by the jewel, which is removed from the city, vanishes as soon as it leaves the city's gates, returning to its original location in Xin-Grafar. This even applies to the Jewel of Everlasting Gold itself. Finally, the Jewel of Everlasting Gold is infused with a small amount of Tar-Baphon's own mind. While far from a sentient magic item, it is capable of imparting some of the necromancer's own dark will and malicious intent into those who touch it. Very reminiscent of the Ring of Power, which seems very appropriate for an artifact associated with the closest thing to a Sauron analog which Golarion has. Speaking of which, the first return of the Whispering Tyrant. For nearly 2,500 years, the horrors of Tar-Baphon were considered a memory. Little more than a lesson on the dangers of necromancy and arch-wizardry should they go unchecked. But all that changed in 3203 AR, when the unthinkable happened. Tar-Baphon, the mightiest necromancer in at least 8 millennia, returned to the world, this time as a Lich. Tar-Baphon had carefully planned his confrontation with Eredin, staging the entire event so he might be struck down at the hands of a god. This had been the final ingredient in his formula for lichdom, the employment of divine power in the destruction of his mortal form. And even as Tar-Baphon's corpse rotted in the ground of Ustalav, his dark rituals completed their work over thousands of years, finally culminating in his transformation and dark resurrection in 3203. And upon his return, Tar-Baphon declared a new title for himself, the Whispering Tyrant, champion of the Whispering Way, and the mightiest Lich to have ever existed. Upon his return, the Whispering Tyrant raised his legions, gathering his followers from the Whispering Way, summoning whole armies of undead which he had prepared thousands of years before, and calling forth from Belkzen the innumerable hordes of the Orcs. Now mightier than ever, Tar-Baphon unleashed his forces onto the world. He first set his sights on Ustalav, the land of his birth. Ustalav had existed as a unified kingdom for nearly 1,000 years, and was enjoying its 5th straight century of growth and prosperity. The kingdom was divided into 16 counties, each of which was managed by a ruling count, who owed fealty to the king. With the return of Tar-Baphon, however, this golden age would come to an abrupt and tragic end. One by one, each of the 16 counties fell to the Whispering Tyrant's forces. Most, like the southern county of Grodlich, were conquered through force of arms, unable to respond quickly enough to the tyrant's threat. More on the conquest of Grodlich later. As army after army threw itself against the tyrant's forces, he simply raised the corpses from the fields of battle, constantly replenishing his legions. The divided nature of the counties likely contributed to this failure, as the nature of the specific threat posed by Tar-Baphon required a well-coordinated large-scale assault, with constant offensive pressure to keep the necromancer from easily replenishing his forces. That said, not all of Tar-Baphon's conquests were military in nature. North of Grodlich, in neighboring Virholt, the ruling count witnessed the dangers posed by the tyrant and was overcome with cowardice. He offered up his county and all its citizens willingly in exchange for his own salvation. Few records remain from this dark time, but for generations afterward this count was derided and cursed by the thousands of victims and their descendants whom he sold into bondage. Within 3 years, all 16 counties of Ustalav had fallen to the tyrant. They were the first victims of his ravenous hunger for conquest, but they would not by any means be the last. Before he could extend his reach, however, Tar-Baphon needed to fully establish his domination of this new territory. Ustalav was about to experience the full might of the horrors which the Whispering Tyrant and his demented followers could bring to bear, and it would take more than 500 years for any meaningful help to arrive. A minute ago, I brought up Grodlich and Virholt in specific because these two counties played host to the worst of Tar-Baphon's corruption. In the Age of Lost Omens, these territories were treated as one and were renamed Virlich. The territory, which would become known as Virlich, served as the seat of power for the tyrant, and the rallying point for many of his armies. The economic center of the region was the local capital of Atarak, a mining town in the Hungry Mountains famous for its gemstone production. The town's relative prosperity ground to a halt with the arrival of Tar-Baphon. The necromancer recognized the town's rich ore veins and defensible position and saw an opportunity. He marched in his armies, slaughtering huge portions of the population and enslaving those who survived. These laborers were sent back into the mines, but were forced to delve deeper and more recklessly than they had ever done before. Tar-Baphon drove his slaves ever deeper into the earth, forcing them to extract the strange and malevolent stone and ore of the Darklands. Using this material, the tyrant ordered the construction of a new, terrible monolith. This citadel of black stone would be Gallowspire, a fortress from which the tyrant could rule with impunity, and a monument to his cruelty, malice, and might. As the tower was completed, the mines were sealed, and the workers left underground to work themselves to death, then be raised by their master's vicious necromancy so their suffering might never end. Gallowspire itself was among the most terrifying sights in all of Golarion. A single tower of slate-gray stone pierced 400 feet into the skies over what remained of Atarak, its flat walls decorated with hundreds upon hundreds of hooks, spikes, and chains. Upon each of these were the remains of the tyrant's many enemies, placed there as a reminder of the necromancer's might, and a promise to all who opposed him about what awaited them. Though some of these corpses dated as far back as the tower's completion, they all remained preserved in all their festering horror, sustained by the dark magics which infused the whole structure. A few of these corpses even returned to activity as a unique type of undead called the Gallowdead, who can use the chains from which they hang as lashes to attack their opponents. Surrounding the Tower of Gallowspire was the Undead Swarm, a maelstrom of wailing incorporeal spirits, drawn to the Whispering Tyrant's terrible power. This spectral cyclone emanated from the tower for 500 feet in all directions, making aerial approach impossible for all but the strongest of invaders. The individual spirits within the storm took many forms, but included high-level ghosts, shadows, and even dread wraiths. The storm made for a haunting sight to all who approached Gallowspire, but those approaching from the ground were safe from its effects, likely so Tar-Baphon could gather both his living and undead armies outside his fortress without inconvenience. Of course, the tower at Gallowspire was only the top of the structure. The true fortress lay hidden beneath the ground, carved over centuries out of the mines which had been quarried out to build the tower above. This twisting labyrinth of tunnels, corridors, and grand halls could house entire armies if the need arose, and played host to the tyrant's own living quarters. The entire dungeon was suffused with the haunting screams of the uncountable lives which had been ended within its halls, rendering all who hear them fearful and nauseous. The entire structure was infused with such a high degree of negative energy that all those who die within its walls were raised to undeath within 24 hours. And all healing provided by positive energy was reduced by half. The two most terrifying features within the depths of Gallowspire were almost certainly found in the lowest levels. The first was an underground lake, from which an immense black crystal emerged. This crystal was a strange, naturally occurring extension of the void, the negative energy plane, which manifested on the material plane through unknown means. The second notable feature was a towering black obelisk carved with innumerable runes of power. This represented the whole of Tar-Baphon's arcane knowledge, and might have served as his spellbook. The pillar was inlaid with dozens of traps, but interestingly, I'm not sure how this carved pillar was treated under the Whispering Way's ban on written secrets. Even beyond his capital at Gallowspire, the corrupting influence of Tar-Baphon and his Whispering Way could be felt all throughout the former lands of Ustalav. Nowhere were the people safe from these dangers, and every town, city, or settlement had its own horrific story from the tyrant's conquest. One such story was the tale of Socorro, the Butcher of Carrion Hill. Located in eastern Ustalav, Carrion Hill was a city which had found moderate success in regional trade, though it had a poor reputation as a hideout for criminals and bandits. The town's prosperity allowed the politically savvy wizard Socorro to rise to power and prominence in local government. To the citizens of the town, the wizard was little more than a well-connected and well-spoken man of impressive intellect. Socorro, however, harbored a dark secret. He was a powerful adherent of the Whispering Way, and had seduced his many apprentices and assistants into the cult with promises of immortality through undeath. The necromancer and his followers stalked the streets of Carrion Hill in secret for years, capturing living victims and dragging them back to their subterranean laboratories. There, they conducted dark arcane experiments, culminating in the ritualistic sacrifice of each poor soul they'd taken. Disturbingly, these rituals always involved some degree of cannibalism. This behavior went on for years, until 3203 AR, when Socorro heard whispers in his head, and possibly through the back channels of the Whispering Way. These rumors promised the coming of some dark messiah, and Socorro took them to heart. When Tar-Baphon finally rose as a Lich, Socorro was ready. He enacted his final plan, organizing his followers and leading a mass slaughter of the citizens of Carrion Hill. In the chaos, thousands perished. When the Whispering Tyrant finally arrived at the city's gates, he found them open, with Socorro on his knees, presenting the town as an offering. Impressed, Tar-Baphon whispered the final secret to Lichdom into Socorro's waiting ear, allowing the necromancer to finally complete the transformation he'd been planning for decades. The horrors of the tyrant were not limited to the common folk, however. Ruling families who resisted were wiped out with impunity, with no regard for their supposed nobility or political importance. Nowhere was this made more clear than at the Gardens of Lead. Once called the Garden of Leads, this beautiful complex of fountains, gardens, pools, and ballrooms was the pleasure palace of the most elite among Ustalavic society. With the coming of the tyrant's forces, however, the place was mostly abandoned. That didn't stop one of his lieutenants from conquering it, however, and in suitably macabre and disturbing fashion. The Winterwhite Disane led her army into the garden's gates, bringing with her the nobles which the tyrant had captured in his initial conquest. She opened the gates and ushered the nobles in, bidding them to dance and celebrate as they once had. As the festivities commenced, Disane enacted her plan. She ordered her legions to release huge quantities of boiling lead into the facility, encasing the nobles in liquid metal which would harden and trap them for all time. The souls of these poor victims were driven mad with the pain, and returned en masse as ghosts, reenacting the dances and celebrations which had preceded their deaths. Disane herself took up residence in the gardens, where she would remain for the rest of the tyrant's conquest. Of course, not all territories in Ustalav were conquered by the tyrant's lieutenants acting on their own whims. Some, like the Kasnoriva Mages College, attracted his personal attention. Perhaps out of fear of what the local Ustalavic mages might know about his history, Tar-Baphon made the arcane school one of his earliest targets after his ascension to power. he directed the enslaved Marilith, Caltestrua, to lead a small army of demons from the Outer Rifts against the school. This attack was sudden and unexpected, and the students and master mages were unable to offer much in the way of meaningful resistance. The demons even managed to turn the school's innate magical defenses and traps against the students and faculty, ensuring their victory all the more. Caltestrua settled in the structure thereafter, and spent centuries fending off the spirits of the school's inhabitants, who returned from death to protect their school from intruders. It seems likely that she remained there on Tar-Baphon's direct orders, though why he would ask that of her remains unclear. While many of Tar-Baphon's followers were enslaved to his bidding directly, others were so unfailingly loyal that they were trusted to operate almost independently with no meaningful oversight. One such loyalist was the vampire lord Malleus. Malleus was among the most powerful and dangerous of the tyrant's lieutenants, and commanded enormous armies on his master's behalf. It was Malleus who conquered most of northern Ustalav in the tyrant's name, leading his armies from Castle Cronquist, which he'd constructed as his personal fortress and residence. His armies were known for their relentless marches and the swath of near-total annihilation they left in their wake. Malleus was certainly among the most powerful vampires on Golarion, but he had an incessant need to enforce his superiority over his fellows, a flaw which would eventually come back to bite him. Though Malleus himself was supremely loyal to the Whispering Tyrant for reasons unknown, his view was hardly the norm among his kind. Many vampires took issue with the Whispering Way's ultimate goal of the total death of Golarion, as that would leave them with no source of food and condemn them to an eternity of starvation. Malleus, however, would hear no such doubts. In 3220, he led the Blood Drought, a systemic purge of all disloyal vampires from Ustalav. This left only small cells of rebellious vampires within the tyrant's territory, and even these were hesitant to reveal their true beliefs out of fear of Malleus's retribution. Another powerful and noteworthy lieutenant was the scholar Geir. Geir is a bit of an interesting character, since only a few sources provide details on him, and these details all contradict. The Carrion Crown AP claims that he was a lich from a distant world, who allied with Tar-Baphon before the necromancer died at the hands of Erodin, then returned to service after the Whispering Tyrant's return. Other sources, like Rule of Fear or the Strange Aeons AP, claim he was not a lich when he entered Tar-Baphon's service, and make no mention of his extraterrestrial origin, or his service prior to the tyrant's rise. I tend to agree with the later sources, but I'm not entirely certain which are the most accurate. What's important for our story are Geir's actions during the tyrant's reign in Ustalav. Geir was a scholar of all manner of topics, and these studies took him to many locations throughout the Great Beyond, including the Dimension of Dreams. On one of these excursions, Geir came across something incredible: a copy of the Necronomicon, translated into Greek and stolen away from its native Earth. Unable to read the book, but convinced of its importance, Geir took the text back to Golarion and began a profane exercise: the translation of the Necronomicon into Necril, the language of the dead. This translation was undertaken in secret, as it directly violated the Whispering Way's edict against writing down secrets. Geir recognized the blasphemy of what he was doing, and that it might see him expelled from the cult, or even killed, but was convinced that his translation would be so impressive and powerful that Tar-Baphon himself would pardon the necromancer for his sins. Out of a desperation to buy time and to protect himself, Geir placed incredibly powerful magics upon his translation, warding it from all forms of divination, or other magical location and tracking. The mysteries which Geir unraveled in this effort proved potent indeed, and Geir soon succeeded in his attempted transformation into a lich. And as Geir entered his 8th year of translation, he was convinced that he would soon be able to present his gift to his master. But more on that later. Another noteworthy scholar in possession of an ancient text at this time was, of course, Kothos of Mekatar. The powerful Nosferatu had vanished with Tar-Baphon's death at the hands of Erodin, taking with him his precious key of Geb. With the Whispering Tyrant's return, however, Kothos came out of the woodwork, even more convinced that the Wizard King would be a harbinger of the end of all things. He brought with him the Key of Geb, which eventually wound up in the tyrant's own personal possession. I should note that some rumors among the highest echelons of the Whispering Way claim that the Key of Geb is secretly Tar-Baphon's soul cage. I don't believe these rumors, personally, but I have absolutely no evidence to back up this belief. Regardless, Kothos became an agent of the tyrant once again, and served loyally in the king's empire during this period. Moving back to Tar-Baphon himself, one notable action which the Whispering Tyrant took during this period of conquest was his return to the Isle of Terror. The island had not been meaningfully resettled during his absence, due in large part to the dangers presented by the portal to the void which the necromancer had opened in life. As a result, the tyrant was able to reclaim his holdings on the Isle of Terror with relative ease. One being on the isle who took up residence in the intervening years since Tar-Baphon's death was the powerful nightwing called Jolanera. Jolanera had emerged from the void into the Isle of Terror and risen to the top of the local food chain. With the return of Tar-Baphon, however, she found her position threatened. The tyrant, though, offered her a bargain: her service in exchange for his knowledge, specifically the knowledge of the portal he had created in the Wizard King's pit. Jolanera, an opportunist to the core, accepted this deal, becoming yet another servant of Tar-Baphon. While I am discussing these various conquests and military operations, I should clarify that they did not occur overnight. Tar-Baphon was and remains patient beyond belief. He thinks on the scale of gods and demigods, and his plans operate in the very long term. As a demonstration of that, these conquests I've been describing took place over a period of about 500 years. From Tar-Baphon's return in 3203, his armies marched and conquered for half a millennium, to the point that, by the 3700s, his forces controlled all of modern Ustalav and the modern Gravelands, and threatened huge swaths of central Avestan. At this point, the fear which had driven Erodin to slay Tar-Baphon in the first place, the fear of the return of the tyranny of the Rune Lords, had very much come to fruition. Tar-Baphon now rivaled many of the Rune Lords in power, and even exceeded a few of them. And yet, Erodin, who was still active as the living god of humanity in Absalom, refused to act. The reason for his inaction is unexplained, even in the Age of Lost Omens. And yet, the humans who Erodin claimed to protect, as well as the other sentient ancestries of Avestan, recognized the danger of the Whispering Tyrant. They witnessed the threat he posed, and saw fit to take action for themselves. The Shining Crusade. In 3754 AR, the leaders of the Empire of Taldor came to the conclusion that Tar-Baphon needed to be defeated. While this was, in part, due to the danger which the tyrant presented, there was certainly a small amount of selfish motivation on the parts of the Taldans. Tar-Baphon and his armies presented a check on Taldan expansion in central Avestan, limiting the scope of future imperial conquests in the region. Still, many Taldans sought to defeat the Lich King purely because of the evil he represented, and regardless of motivation, the act of defeating him was universally regarded as a good thing. But, of course, the Taldans were only one faction in the Inner Sea region, and they wouldn't have been able to face the tyrant's forces on their own. Thankfully, the dwarves of the Sky Citadel Kragodan, who had been allies of the Taldans for over 3,000 years, rose to the challenge. Kragodan was located in the southern Mindspin Mountains, putting them close enough to the tyrant's forces to feel his threat upon their door, a fact which only increased their motivation to fight in the coming war. To formalize the alliance, the dwarves and Taldans agreed to a political marriage between Taldor's general Shea Veriton and a prominent dwarf noble. In celebration of the marriage, the dwarves of Kragodan forged the Band of the Crusaders Alliance, a ring infused with powerful magic. The ring was specially designed with General Veriton in mind, as she was well known for her fidgety and generally nervous behavior. The ring consisted of two components, an outer and inner ring, which could be spun around one another, to allow Veritan to always keep her hands busy. On the day of the marriage, the ring supposedly saved the general's life twice, once when it snagged on the scroll of an enchanter who sought to ensnare the general's mind, and once when the general's own fidgeting with the ring accidentally knocked over a goblet of poisoned wine. From that day on, both the general and the ring developed a reputation for inexplicable good luck. With the alliance secure, the Taldans and the dwarves of Kragodan set out for their planned staging area, the Ustalavic city of Velumis, and with the staging area secure, the Shining Crusade had begun. I should note before I continue that this is where accounts of the war diverge slightly. Most sources I could find, in both 1e and 2e, claim that Velumis was always under the Crusaders' control, and that it served as the initial staging area for the war. The Lost Omens Knights of Lastwall book, however, contends that Velumis wasn't liberated until 3801, much later in the war. I think this is a mistake on the part of the writers, however. The authors probably got Velumis mixed up with Vontil, another city on Lake Encarthen, which all the other sourcebooks agree was liberated in 3801, and served as a beachhead into northern Ustalav. This is the assumption I'm using moving forward, but bear in mind that the Knights of Lastwall book is among the latest sources published on the topic of the Crusade, so it might represent a retcon. Also, before I continue, it's worth addressing the issue of teleportation. The armies of Taldor and Kragodan were supported by large numbers of powerful spellcasters, so discerning viewers might be wondering why the military campaign focused on overland travel, with all the logistical complexity that entailed. While teleportation magic certainly would have been useful in transporting large numbers of soldiers from place to place across most battlefields, such magic proved useless against Tar-Baphon on his home turf. During his 500-year uncontested reign, the Whispering Tyrant recognized the threat teleportation posed to his rule. All the armies in the world would mean nothing if his enemies could simply bypass them. In response to this danger, the Tyrant devised a simple countermeasure. He developed the Witch Gates, powerful artifacts which entangled the natural ley lines running throughout his kingdom. These lines typically served as highways for teleportation magic, and by routing and rerouting the lines through the Witch Gates, the Tyrant could force all long-range teleportation within his region to terminate at one of the gates. These gates were carefully constructed in regions where any arriving invaders could easily be ambushed and contained, and it didn't take long for the Crusaders to discover that any forces teleported into Ustalav or Virlich failed to reach their intended target, and were quickly destroyed. In response, the leaders of the Crusade abandoned teleportation as a tactic, and were forced to rely on more conventional means of troop movement. While many of the battles in this early period of the war have been lost to history or not detailed by Paizo, one conflict in particular proved tremendously important, though only well after the fact. In 3754, the Lich Geir concluded his translation of the Necronomicon into Necril. To ensure that only he and his master would ever have access to the completed text, he destroyed his original Greek copy, then set out for Gallowspire to present his translation to the Whispering Tyrant. Unfortunately for the researcher, he found himself targeted by a group of champions from the Crusade, who destroyed his body and captured his precious book. The Crusaders recognized the profanity of what they had captured, though they couldn't comprehend the underlying power which they now held. Unsure of what else to do, the Crusaders sent the book back to Taldor for further study. Geir, meanwhile, reformed from his soul cage in his research chambers at Gasterhall. Terrified that his great work was now lost, and couldn't be recovered thanks to his own magical wards, Geir realized that the only chance for him to survive was to simply pretend the whole affair had never happened. For the remainder of the Crusade and beyond, Geir would never reveal that he had translated and subsequently lost the Necronomicon, for fear of what his fellow Whispering Way agents would do. For the next 45 years, the Shining Crusade launched attack after attack on the forces of the Whispering Tyrant from Velumis, but they were unable to make serious headway north into Ustalav proper. While numerous other great deeds occurred during this period, many of them haven't been described in much detail, so I'm going to fast forward to the most relevant portions of the story. The battles against the tyrant's forces exacted a heavy toll on the Crusaders. Every fallen warrior could be raised by the necromancers of the Whispering Way, meaning all losses the Crusaders suffered were effectively reinforcements for the enemy. Decades of battle wore on, but no forward progress into the tyrant's central territories was ever made. Finally, in 3801 AR, the stalemate came to an end. After years of conflict on the waters of Lake Encarthen, the soldiers of the Shining Crusade finally managed to imprison the Omox demon Jobox, who had, until then, been sinking their vessels with impunity. With their mobility on the lake finally secured, the Crusaders made a desperate play for a beachhead in Ustalav proper. Their forces landed in the coastal city of Vontil, engaging in what was thought to be a suicide mission against the forces of the vampire lord Malleus. But fortune, it would seem, was on their side. Malleus was traveling to Caliphus at this time to put down a rising resistance to his rule among his fellow vampires. By the time he heard of the knight's incursion into his territory, they had already secured the town and were fortifying their position. When Malleus was finally able to rally his forces for a counterattack, he found the knights too well prepared, and his assault was repelled. Vontil was securely in the hands of the Crusaders, and with that, the war took a drastic turn. With the liberation of Vontil, the Shining Crusade became a two-front war, with armies in the south able to maintain pressure, while armies in the north could drive a wedge between the forces of Tar-Baphon and Malleus, all while making a direct push for Gallowspire. This forced the tyrant's generals to divide their attention, keeping them from meaningfully recovering ground, and likely impacting their ability to reliably reinforce themselves by raising legions of the fallen. This second phase of the war, which lasted for 26 years, represented the fiercest fighting of the war, and as the years wore on, many among the Crusade's leadership saw the need for more support. One member of the Taldan nobility who recognized this need was General Arnazant, the supreme leader of the Taldan forces in the conflict. Arnazant was one of the Taldans whose motivations were entirely pure. He saw the tyrant as a corrupting force in the world who needed to be struck down for the sake of the common good. Convinced of both the nobility of his cause and Taldor's need for allies, Arnazant secretly traveled to the headquarters of the Knights of Ozem in 3816 AR. The Knights of Ozem were a legendary knightly order of powerful warriors dedicated to Erodin and to Erasni, the Red Crusader and demigoddess who served as the herald of Erodin. Arnazant presented himself to the order's leader, the mortal knight Iomide, and begged for her aid. Iomide heard Arnazant's arguments and was impressed by the nobility of his intentions, but feared that, like many before him, the general might be attempting to manipulate her. As a final show of good faith, Arnazant presented Iomide with a gift, the famous Taldan relic Taldaris' Bequeathal. This suit of mithril armor had been worn by Taldor's founder, the Grand Prince Taldaris I, who bequeathed it upon his death to the nation of Taldor. In presenting the armor to Iomide and the Knights of Ozem, Arnazant was declaring that the future of Taldor was hers to protect. Convinced the general's motivations were pure, Iomide accepted the offer and donned Taldaris' bequeathal, which she would wear for the remainder of the conflict with Tar-Baphon. It's worth noting that Arnazant was acting in secret in making this offering, and when the Grand Prince of Taldor discovered it, he nearly hanged Arnazant then and there. With the support of the Knights of Ozem, the Shining Crusade found new life, and their strengthened morale caused them to fight all the harder and push ever deeper into the Whispering Tyrant's lands. This period, after the enlistment of the Knights of Ozem, is the period from which most of the greatest tales of the Crusade originate. While the exact date of many of these events are unclear, I'll present them here in the order in which I think they happened. Sometime after the joining of the Knights of Ozem, one of their order, a knight named Jalnison, stood against legions of Ghasts to buy time for the escape of her allies. Jalnison was captured and taken before Tar-Baphon's chief torturer and questioner, the vicious spectre Kulnart Soulflay. Soulflay tortured Jalnison for information, demanding that she provide intelligence on the plans and tactics of her fellow Crusaders. But, for 7 days and 7 nights, Jalnison resisted. As the sun set on her 7th day in captivity, the knight felt her resolve strengthen. She offered a prayer to her patron, Erasni, asking for strength, and Erasni, the Red Crusader, answered. Jalnison felt herself bathed in light and filled with strength, then snapped the shackles which bound her wrists, freeing herself. She then used her own chains as weapons to destroy dozens of her captors, smiting the undead with Erasni's own power. By the time the sun rose on her prison, Jalnison had freed all her fellow captors and had destroyed Soulflay with the very chains he had used to bind her. Jalnison, who would go on to be called Jalnison the Virtuous, led her fellow prisoners back to Taldan territory, where they took up the fight once more. Another famous story from this period occurred not on the battlefront in Ustalav, but in the Taldan homeland. With the continuing advance of the Shining Crusade, Tar-Baphon sought to undercut Taldan's support for the war effort. To do this, he ordered the Wyrmwraith Zalzaros the Ravener to attack the Taldan homeland. Zalzaros arrived in Taldor unscathed, and found the countryside largely undefended, leaving it ripe for his assault. Only a handful of generals and legions remained in Taldor as a defending force, and none of them were a match for Zalzaros. Eventually, the Wyrmwraith was even able to besiege the capital of Opara itself. Recognizing the desperation of her situation, General Medea Lionsleap set out into the country in search of a legend. Following a tale of one of her ancestors, General Lionsleap located the Grograsant. This mythical lion-like creature from Taldan history was infused with a smattering of divine power, and had appeared several times throughout the nation's past to test the mettle of Taldan heroes. General Medea Lionsleap offered the creature a meal marinated in the finest Taldan wine. The Grograsant, recognizing the general's worth and bravery, consumed her offering, then marked her with its blood and allowed her to ride it. Taking up the Lance of the Leaping Lion, which had been infused with the magic of the Grograsant generations before by her own ancestor, General Medea set out upon the lion for Opara. The pair arrived and challenged Zalzaros the Ravager. Leaping into the sky, General Lionsleap struck the Wyrmwraith with a single blow, killing him instantly, before the Grograsant tore the monster limb from limb and scattered the remains into the sea. As the crusade progressed, the Knights of Ozem recognized a flaw in the group's grand strategy. For all their military might, the Crusaders lacked a reliable means of countering the personal might of Tar-Baphon. The Whispering Tyrant was so singularly powerful that it had taken the might of a god to defeat him the first time, and with his return as a Lich, he seemed even more insurmountable. Eredin, for reasons the knights could not determine, refused to take direct action against his old foe, leaving the knights with no choice but to call out to their patron. In 3818 AR, 2 years after joining the war, the Knights of Ozem summoned Erasni, their patroness and the herald of Eredin, who chose to aid them in their crusade. Out of fear for the Whispering Tyrant's dark magic, however, the Knights of Ozem chose to bind Erasni to them with powerful magic of their own, rather than relying on her to keep her word and fight of her own volition. Erasni still consented to fight, but this action by the Knights planted the seeds of doubt and resentment deep in her heart. For more on how these seeds came to bloom, check out my video on Erasni. For the record, it's unclear how much Iomide was directly involved in the decision to bind Erasni. We just don't know. For the next 5 years, Erasni directly supported the efforts of the Shining Crusade, as its forces drove ever deeper into the tyrant's territory. Erasni became the patron saint of the entire crusade, and tales of her victories drew ever more soldiers and warriors into the conflict, all inspired to follow her and her quest to vanquish evil. Finally, in 3823 AR, the Red Crusader came face to face with the Whispering Tyrant. Erasni struggled mightily against her foe, hurling her most powerful magics against him, but to no avail. After a titanic struggle, Erasni fell and was captured. Tar-Baphon stole Erasni away and took great pleasure in slowly torturing and humiliating the demigoddess, taking out all his rage and disgust upon this servant of Eredin who had been so arrogant as to challenge him. It wasn't until later that year, at the Battle of the Three Sorrows, when Erasni would be seen again. The Knights of Ozem had witnessed Erasni's capture and were mounting a rescue mission deep within the mountains of Ustalav when Tar-Baphon appeared before them at the head of his armies. He hurled Erasni's corpse among the Crusaders, shattering their morale and leaving them floundering in the face of his armies. And this might have been the end of the Shining Crusade had it not been for Iyomide. To explain this properly, I need to backtrack slightly. Leading up to the Battle of the Three Sorrows, one of Tar-Baphon's generals, the Morg Erumhel, devised a plan to further cut the knees out from under the Shining Crusade. Erumhel was one of the few followers who had been with Tar-Baphon since before his return as a Lich. Erumhel, who had been dubbed by historians the Lord of Morgs, was incredibly powerful, and had a reputation among the Crusaders as a deadly, cruel, and conniving foe. Erumhel saw the Battle of the Three Sorrows as an opportunity, and enacted his plan with care and precision. The Lord of Morgs sought to assassinate Iyomide, the leader of the Knights of Ozem. Leading up to the battle, he targeted one of the young knight's bodyguards each night, dragging them away into the darkness, then torturing and killing them. He then returned the guard's severed head, inscribed with the name of the next guard to be targeted. One by one, the guards of Iyomide fell, until her protectors were entirely wiped out. Finally, on the day of the battle, Erumhel entered Iomide's camp for his final kill, expecting to find her cowering and weak. Iyomide, however, stood tall and ready, unafraid. In her hands was the Chalice of Ozem, an artifact infused with incredible protective magic. The details of the following fight have been largely lost to history, but what is clear is that it concluded with Erumhel defeated and crippled, fleeing into the Darklands. Iyomide, blind, incoherent, and severely injured, was victorious, and her victory restored the hope of the Crusaders. Beaten, but not broken, the Crusaders took up Erasni's corpse and retreated out of the mountains. Her body was taken to Fort Loren, the future site of the city of Vigil, where it was laid to rest and treated with the highest honor. From Fort Loren, Iyomide and General Arnazant would rally their forces, regaining the ground they had lost and continuing to push toward Gallowspire. For the next 4 years, the crusade took the form of a grinding overland campaign, with the knights maintaining constant pressure from Velumis, while others marched steadily toward Gallowspire from Vauntil. As the knights continued their long, slow string of successes, Tar-Baphon kicked off a series of preparatory contingency plans. The most relevant of these, for our purposes, was the creation of a number of vast sepulchres, massive underground tombs and vaults, packed with hundreds upon hundreds of preserved corpses, ready to be raised as undead soldiers. These sepulchres were sealed after their completion, leaving hordes of undead warriors buried underground to await their master's call at some future date. At some point during 3826, Iyomide found herself leading on the front lines, when she was personally targeted by Tar-Baphon's magic. The Whispering Tyrant shattered the knight's sword, leaving her unarmed and surrounded by enemies. Undeterred, Iyomide called out a prayer to Eredin. Her conviction was rewarded, and the sword was immediately and magically reforged, transforming from a simple magical sword into the legendary artifact Heart's Edge. With the advent of 3827 AR, the Crusaders had drawn incredibly close to the tyrant's capital at Gallowspire. They had successfully wedged themselves between Tar-Baphon and the forces of his most powerful and loyal general, Malleus in the north. Still, the victory was hardly guaranteed, and they still faced down the mightiest of Tar-Baphon's forces, as well as the tyrant himself. The final battle of the crusade would take place in and around the ruins of Adarak, in sight of Gallowspire's looming tower. Before the battle, Arnazant and his forces departed their base at Fort Loren, and the general ordered a contingent of knights called the Realmsguard to remain behind. He declared that they were the greatest of Taldor's knights, and it would be their responsibility to defend the world from the tyrant should the final assault fail. Burdened with this terrible purpose, the Realm's Guard remained in Fort Loren. They kept their vigil for nearly a week, until a lone undead warrior revealed himself outside the fort. The knights deployed, but in doing so, they had fallen into a trap. The undead creature revealed himself as a cleric of Urgathoa named Varkinoth the Shadecaller, and opened a series of planar rifts to unleash a small army of nightshades upon the knights. The Realm's Guard should have been overwhelmed and slaughtered, but they held firm. By the end of the night, a lone Realm's Guard remained, all her companions and enemies having been killed in the terrible battle. This was Anyelvona Titheriond, and she took it upon herself to gather the fallen shields of her allies and use them to forge a belt which would go on to be named the Belt of the Last Wall. This would be the penultimate battle of the Shining Crusade. Not long after, in the fields surrounding Gallowspire, the armies of the Tyrant and the Crusade finally squared off. Most of the details of the final battle have never been published, but one specific confrontation has been detailed extensively: the final fight between General Arnazant and the Whispering Tyrant. Seeking to bring the crusade to an immediate and dramatic conclusion, Tar-Baphon sought out General Arnazant. Facing off against the general in single combat, the tyrant extended his open hand and cast a wish spell, wishing for the general's heart to fly into his palm. In his arrogance, the tyrant had failed to account for one thing. Arnazant bore the Shield of Eredin. This shield had been blessed by the living god of humanity to protect its wielder from all forms of harm, and was among the most powerful artifacts on all of Golarion. Sensing that its bearer was in danger, the Shield of Eredin absorbed the magic of Tar-Baphon's wish. Overpowered by the necromancer's magic, the shield exploded with power, bursting into 12 shards which flew in all directions. One of these shards impaled itself upon the tyrant's extended hand, infusing him with a surge of positive energy and wounding him severely. Driven to a point of weakness which he hadn't experienced since his defeat at the hands of Eredin, Tar-Baphon fled into the depths of Gallowspire to recover his strength. This ended the greater battle, as the remainder of the tyrant's forces either followed him into the fortress or collapsed without their leader and were slaughtered. The Crusaders had won their final battle, but Tar-Baphon was not yet dead. Exhausted, low on supplies, and overwhelmed at the idea of locating and destroying Tar-Baphon's soul cage, the leaders of the Shining Crusade made a difficult decision. Rather than invading Gallowspire and sacrificing thousands of lives, they chose to seal it, locking the Whispering Tyrant and his most powerful followers beneath the ground with no means of escape. General Arnazant gave the order to seal the structure as he lay dying, his body having finally failed him after decades of war. Acting on this order, the Eredinite priest Narthok summoned all of the magic his god would provide and created the Great Seal, a powerful divine magical seal which closed off the lower levels of Gallowspire. The magic of the seal was so powerful that it infused the very walls of Gallowspire itself, making the walls of even the deepest chambers of the dungeon impenetrable from the inside, leaving Tar-Baphon and his minions with no means of escape. In addition to the primary seal, 3 lesser seals were also produced. Each of these lesser seals would need to be destroyed in order to destroy the Great Seal, and so long as even one of the 3 remained, the Great Seal was entirely impregnable. Narthok bestowed one of the 3 seals to each of the 3 factions among the Crusaders, the Taldans, the Dwarves of Kragadan, and the Knights of Ozem. Each group was ordered to take their seal far away into the lands of the living, so the tyrant's remaining undead servants might never locate them and free their dark master. And thus, the Shining Crusade, the largest military operation in the memory of the Inner Sea region, came to an end. After more than 500 years, the reign of the Whispering Tyrant had finally been ended. After the Crusade. With the collapse of Tar-Baphon's formal command structure, major military operations in the region slowly began to wind down. That's not to say, however, that all hostilities ceased overnight. In the north of Ustalav, General Malleus and his forces were functionally independent and had yet to be addressed. Malleus himself wanted desperately to continue the fighting, and might have been able to do so with tremendous success were it not for a single message from the tyrant. Immediately prior to his imprisonment, Tar-Baphon sent a simple command to the vampire lord: wait. And so Malleus retreated into his fortress at Castle Cronquist in the north, forcing the Crusaders to enact a protracted siege. Moving on from Malleus, the orcs of Belkzen retreated from Ustalav. With the unifying force of the tyrant now gone, the orcs soon fell to infighting and complicated internal rivalries. This didn't prevent them from posing a threat to their neighbors, of course, but more on that later. The Whispering Tyrant's other major lieutenants either all went into hiding or fortified the small positions they still controlled. Dessain secured the Gardens of Lead, choosing to rely on the unwillingness of the Crusaders to spend the lives necessary to take them from her. Socorro, the butcher of Carrion Hill, disappeared, vanishing into the night to parts unknown. Geir, the scholar who lost the Necronomicon, retreated to Gasterhall, the tyrant's former prison library, where he eventually transformed into a demi-lich. Gasterhall would remain a base of operations for the Whispering Way all the way into the Age of Lost Omens, with Geir as its master and head researcher. Erumhel, the Lord of Morgs, who was defeated by Iomide, never emerged from the depths of the Darklands, though he always maintained his hatred for Iomide and his desire to match her ascension to power so their duel might continue. None of these lieutenants ever acquired the means of freeing their Dark Master from his prison in Gallowspire, and several might have been hesitant to do so regardless. Other major operations among the Whispering Way took similar actions, going into hiding or enforcing their existing positions. While the forces of the Shining Crusade ran many of these forces to ground, some they simply found too difficult to quash or hunt down. While this might seem like a failure on the part of the Crusaders to take advantage of their position, it's important to recognize just how exhausting and expensive the war had been. The Shining Crusade had lasted more than 70 years, and in that time the loss of life on the part of the Crusaders had been nothing short of devastating. The Sky Citadel of Kragodan, for instance, lost nearly a third of its total population over the course of the war, permanently crippling its economic and military capabilities. Taldor had suffered similarly, but had a much larger population to absorb the damage. With all this loss, most of the political support for the Crusade rapidly evaporated after the imprisonment of the tyrant. The result of this was a general unwillingness on the part of the Crusaders to commit to the long, tiresome, and dangerous process of hunting down and eliminating the few remaining agents of the Whispering Way. They had eliminated the majority of the cult's operations, and that was widely deemed sufficient. But this wasn't the case across the board. The Knights of Ozem had been the ideological backbone of the Shining Crusade in the final phase of the war, and their enthusiasm for the cause continued well after the war's conclusion. While they were convinced to largely abandon their pursuit of the remaining cultists of the Way, the Knights remained committed to their opposition to the tyrant. To maintain their watch over Gallowspire, the Knights of Ozem established the Nation of Lastwall in the southern regions of the tyrant's former lands. This kingdom would become the seat of power for the Knights, who established or re-established many fortress cities in the region. The capital of this new nation would be the newly founded city of Vigil, built in the ruins of the village of Rookmin around Fort Loren. Castle Overwatch was raised at this location, from which the leader of the new nation, the Watcher Lord, would rule. Additionally, the Knights of Ozem established the Crusader War College, a training school for military tactics which would become legendary for its famed cavalry program. At some point, Erasni's corpse was formally laid to rest in Vigil, where it would remain in state as a reminder of the dedication needed to stand against evil. The Red Crusader would not remain in Vigil, however, but that's a story for another video. The purpose of Lastwall as a nation was to maintain a constant watch on Gallowspire, to observe the fortress and watch for any activity on the part of Tar-Baphon or his servants. The Knights of Ozem made constant monthly patrols to Gallowspire, and had additional patrols throughout Virlich more broadly. These efforts occasionally succeeded in crushing the activities of the Whispering Way in the region, but the cultists mostly learned to operate out of sight of the Knights. Unfortunately, the Knights of Ozem were not only opposed by the Whispering Way or the lingering servants of the tyrant. The Orcs of Belkzen were a constant thorn in the side of the Crusaders, raiding Lastwall's western border and the various settlements and forts which the Knights had established. These Orc raids eventually surpassed the activities of the Way in terms of frequency and danger, and became the primary challenge faced by the Knights. Fortunately, the preferred fighting style of the Knights, large-scale cavalry charges across open terrain, was well suited to these conflicts, and proved quite effective against the raiders. To the north of Lastwall, the tower Gallowspire remained a constant, terrifying sight for the next 900 years. The tower was always haunted by the specter of Tar-Baphon's lingering power, and the hostility of the surrounding region ensured that no efforts would ever be undertaken to meaningfully purge the exterior of the structure of the tyrant's influence or evil. The tower constantly attracted undead threats, and the storm of spirits which haunted the surrounding skies never dissipated. The ruins of surrounding Atarak remained haunted and stalked by numerous undead horrors, all of which were simply too much trouble to clear out. Gallowspire remained a constant pilgrimage site for members of the Whispering Way, who sought desperately for some way to free their champion from his prison. These pilgrims were hardly the only agents of the Way in the region, however, as the cult had many active efforts throughout Virlich. In addition to Gasterhall, which I mentioned earlier, the Whispering Way maintained a base of operations at Wrenchurch, an abbey-turned-fortress in western Virlich. This location was, at the same time, remote enough not to attract notice, and defensible enough to be not worth an assault by the remaining Crusaders or Knights. From here, leaders among the Way, like the Grey Friar, would direct the efforts of the cult toward a variety of ends, most commonly the liberation of the tyrant or the undermining of the Knights of Lastwall. Looping back to Gasterhall briefly, Geir is acknowledged by most sources to be the master of the prison library throughout this period, though some sources claim that, by the 4700s, the structure had come under the control of a being called Lucimar, a necromancer whose undead form had been permanently transformed into that of a wolf. I'm not entirely certain what ultimately happened to Lucimar, but I suspect that this official art of Geir is a not-so-subtle hint about his fate. While the operations of the Whispering Way in the region would continue in secret for the next 900 years, much of their time and effort was spent focusing on rebuilding their strength and replenishing their numbers. There was, however, one exception to this rule. Kothos of Mekatar had been especially devastated by the Whispering Tyrant's defeat, not because he had counted so heavily on the tyrant's victory, but because the Key of Geb, Kothos's most precious relic, had been sealed inside of Gallowspire with the tyrant, while Kothos himself was left outside. Now doubly motivated, the Nosferatu saw only one path forward. He needed to destroy the Lesser Seals which empowered the Great Seal of Gallowspire. To accomplish this task, he formed an organization which he dubbed the Seal Breakers. The goal of this organization was simple: usher in the end of all things by freeing Tar-Baphon from Gallowspire. While this goal put them nominally in line with the members of the Whispering Way in the region, the differences in the ultimate goals of each organization, undead tyranny versus total annihilation, often created a fierce rivalry between the two groups. The Seal Breakers were forced to operate with an even higher degree of secrecy than their counterparts in the Way, and Seal Breaker agents often infiltrated the Way's ranks. To maintain a close watch on Lastwall, Kothos moved his organization into Belkzen, where they took up residence in an ancient Kellid ruin not far from the cenotaph. Moving back to the Crusaders, many relics and artifacts were either created, used, or captured during the Shining Crusade. Many of these I've addressed in part already. The Belt of the Last Wall, for instance, was handed over to the Knights of Ozem, where it was enshrined as a sacred relic. The broken bonds of Jalnison, similarly, were taken up as weapons even after Jalnison's death, and were treated with the same reverence and enshrined at the conclusion of the Crusade. Taldaris' bequeathal, the legendary armor presented to Iomide by General Arnazant as a show of good faith, was returned to Taldor by the knight herself. Iomide had, per Taldan tradition, altered the armor by contributing a single piece as a replacement for one she lost in battle. After her eventual ascension, the armor would forever be marked by a halo of light, a sign of the lingering influence of the inheritor which the relic would hold. On the darker side of things, the Necronomicon captured from Geir was taken back to Zimar in Taldor for study. Scholars who studied the tome found themselves overcome by feelings of paranoia. Eventually, it was locked away in a vault, and wouldn't see the light of day for years, until Qadiran soldiers captured the text and transported it back to Kathir. After years of study there, the Qadiran scholar in charge of the text was overcome by madness, and threw himself from the zenith of the Dawnflower. This finally convinced the Qadirans of the inherent danger of the book, and they locked it away. For more on this particular tome, check out the Strange Aeons adventure path. Two particular artifacts from this period stand out as especially important. The first was Heart's Edge, the sword of Iomide. This blade would be the knight's personal weapon until her ascension to divinity in 3832 AR, at which point it was passed to her followers and church. It would eventually fall into the possession of the Hell Knight Order of the Godclaw. For more on this artifact, check out the Hell's Vengeance adventure path, or my video on Queen Abigail II of House Thrune. Minor spoilers, it doesn't end well. The other most famous artifact from the Shining Crusade was, of course, the Shattered Shield of Arnazant, previously called the Shield of Eredin. Of the 12 shards of the shield, 11 were collected by the Knights of Ozem, with the 12th remaining impaled in Tar-Baphon's hand. The 11 shards were taken to the Crusader War College in Vigil, where they were securely stored as the holiest relic of the Crusade. While the shield had shattered before, when in the possession of Eredin, only the god himself was capable of repairing it, and Eredin, though still alive, was not interested in attempting any sort of repair, or doing much of anything else for that matter. One lesser relic related to the shield is the Grace of the Last Aslanti. This pendant had once been a holy symbol of Eredin, held by General Arnazant himself. Upon the shattering of the shield of Eredin, this holy symbol was infused with a portion of the shield's power. As the general's body was burned upon his funeral pyre, the wood of this symbol burned away, revealing a magically transformed Elysian bronze amulet beneath. This was taken by several knights as a miracle, and the Grace of the Last Aslanti was taken to the city of Almas. With the establishment of the nation of Lastwall and the solidification of the political power of the Knights of Ozem, the geopolitical situation in the region around Gallowspire was stabilized. The kingdom of Ustalav was re-established, with the counties of Grodlich and Virholt having been combined into Virlich. While I could dig into the regional history a bit more, the most relevant developments to our story would not occur for about 900 years. The Events of Carrion Crown. I'm covering Carrion Crown not because it has a lot to do with Tar-Baphon himself, but because it is the premier example of the tactics and activities of the Whispering Way as an organization during the Whispering Tyrant's imprisonment. There's a lot here that isn't immediately relevant to Tar-Baphon's personal story, but I think these details provide excellent context on the broader activities of the cult, and the methods they used so they might free their master. Last chance spoiler warning here. I am about to spoil the events of the Carrion Crown adventure path in their entirety. If you want to skip this section, now's your chance. Sometime during the late 4600s, the exact date has never been published, a child named Adivian was born to the noble Adrazant family in Ustalav. Adivian Adrazant grew into a talented student, and was advantaged by good looks, a wealthy family, and a sharp intellect. While he dedicated himself to his studies from a young age, by his early 20s he found himself bored by his academic, social, and romantic pursuits. He found his interest drawn to the dark and the macabre, things like necromancy, cultic behavior, and especially the history of Tar-Baphon. Adrazant quickly became enthralled with the Whispering Tyrant, seeing the legendary necromancer as a kindred spirit, someone destined for greatness who lacked sufficient challenges for his exceptional intellect. He squandered his family fortune on relics from the tyrant's past as his curiosity slowly descended into obsession. Finally, Adrazant's focus and study yielded a fascinating discovery. Prior to his death at the hands of Eredin, Tar-Baphon sired an heir. This unnamed descendant had children of their own, and the line continued down to one living heir in the Age of Lost Omens, an Ustalavic nobleman named Count Lucinian Galdana of Amans. Believing that he might find a kindred spirit in this count, who descended from greatness, Adrazant arranged a meeting. This proved to be a disaster, however, as Count Galdana turned out to be a small-minded and unimpressive person. Despondent, young Adrazant returned to his home, now believing that he might never find a companion, or other great purpose for his life. On his travels, he passed through Kavapeshta and witnessed a strange ceremony at the Cryptgate Cathedral called the Procession of Unforgotten Souls. During his observation of the ritual, Adivian Adrazant stumbled upon an idea. Tar-Baphon was a product of his bloodline, and the greatness he achieved was in many ways a result of his genetics and the way they responded to the extreme circumstances of his era. Surely, if that same bloodline still existed, it might manifest that same power and greatness if exposed to similar stimuli. Surely, if a member of that bloodline were to suddenly become a Lich, some of that legendary arcane power would reveal itself. And so, Adrazant began to study. He poured himself into ancient necromantic and alchemical texts. He redoubled his search for information on Tar-Baphon's past. He even reached out to agents of the Whispering Way, weaseling his way into their ranks with promises of a way to restore their lost champion. Or, at the very least, create a new one. This was an area of study which not even the members of the Way had ever before breached. A path to lichdom, not for oneself, but for another. Finally, after years of study and effort, Adrazant produced a result. He discovered something bizarre, a verse of poetry whispered to him from some place beyond death, but which was not the afterlife. This verse was a recipe, one which listed all the ingredients necessary for a potion of terrible power, one which would turn the imbiber, the descendant of Tar-Baphon, into a Lich against their will. Adrazant dubbed his discovery the Carrion Crown. And here is another point where I get to cut in as the creator of this video and say, this plan is absolutely ridiculous on its face. I am not picking on the writers here. I think they are fully aware that this is an absurd idea, as it is entirely in line with the weird gothic horror pseudoscience which clearly inspired the story. That said, even if I bought into the whole eugenics-heavy premise that Tar-Baphon was merely a product of his bloodline, which I don't, by the way, the bloodline which eventually passed down to Count Lucinian Galdana would have been so diluted that he would have likely never been anything more than a basic Lich, with not even a hint of any exceptional power. We don't get to see that outcome, but a small part of me really wishes that we had, just so I could see the look on Adrazant's face. Okay, interjection over, back to the lore. In 4711 AR, Adivian Adrazant sent his Whispering Way agents out into Ustalav to collect the ingredients necessary for his twisted brew. And this is where the events of the Carrion Crown adventure path kick off. Acting on Adrazant's orders, the necromancer Auren Vrood took his group of chosen agents of the Whispering Way to the small town of Ravengro. Possibly Ravengrow, but I think Ravengro sounds better. Vrood was a loyal servant of the Way, and had known Adrazant for years by this point. Though Ravengro was little more than a backwater town in eastern Canterwall, it had one feature of note, the long-abandoned Harrowstone prison. Harrowstone had been the main prison for all of Tamravena before the county had been renamed to Canterwall, and Ravengro had initially been built up as the support structure for the whole complex. This all came to an end 50 years prior to the campaign in 4661 AR, when an escape attempt by some exceptionally wicked prisoners resulted in a terrible fire. The conflagration consumed the entire prison, condemning hundreds to a horrendous death. And it was this macabre sight which drew the attention of the Whispering Way. This line in the Carrion Crown poem indicated that the cultists should "keeper of the damned's soul take." Through no small amount of study, the cultists of the Way discovered this was a reference to the last warden of Harrowstone, Lyvar Hochran, who chose to sacrifice himself and his guards to ensure that the most dangerous prisoners would never be able to escape the prison. Lyvar and his men died in flame, alongside the prisoners whose attempted escape they thwarted. But this was not the end of the warden's story. He returned as a tremendously powerful spirit, whose sole goal was to keep the malevolent ghosts of the prisoners in check. In this duty, he became the indicated Keeper of the Damned, and therefore it was his soul which needed to be taken. Auren Vrood and his followers arrived outside of Harrowstone on a dark and stormy night in 4711. They quickly set to work, performing a series of esoteric rituals over a period of a few days. They eventually succeeded in seizing the soul of Warden Hochran, but not before they were discovered by one Professor Portos Lorimor, a local scholar investigating Harrowstone and the Way's interest in the structure. After the professor's death, which they made look like an accident, the cultists of the Way fled Ravengro for Lepidstadt. The death of the professor, however, would prove to be the group's undoing, for several of his former colleagues and students, the player characters of the Carrion Crown AP, would soon arrive and begin investigating their friend's death. After dealing with the now-freed ghosts of Harrowstone, the heroes set out for Lepidstadt to comply with the professor's last will and testament. Arriving in Lepidstadt, the heroes discovered a fascinating scene indeed. The Beast of Lepidstadt, a monster of local legend, had been captured and was on trial for a series of crimes, including several murders. While 2 of the 3 judges in the case were ready to convict on the spot, the third, Embrith Daramid, who was a colleague of the late Professor Lorimor and a secret member of the Esoteric Order of the Palatine Eye, was less convinced. She hired the heroes to investigate the case, to prove definitively one way or another the case against the Beast. The Beast itself was actually a flesh golem, but one blessed with actual sentience and a surprisingly cunning intellect. For those of you getting Major Frankenstein vibes, good. It's not exactly subtle. Meeting with the Beast and investigating the various crimes of which he had been accused, the heroes succeeded in finding sufficient evidence of the Beast's innocence. They presented their case to the judges and managed to free their newfound friend, only for him to invite them to meet his father in nearby Schloss Karamark. Following the Beast, the heroes discovered that Schloss Karamark had been overrun with all manner of rogue experiments and vicious traps, left by agents of the Whispering Way after they abandoned the fortress. Working with the Beast, the heroes faced off against the castle's remaining guardian, the aberrant Promethean, a flesh golem created by the mysterious Count Alpon Karamark. After freeing the Count, the heroes confirmed that he was indeed the Beast's father. The Count then informed them that he had been captured by the Whispering Way, and that they had taken control of the Beast and forced him to acquire an object called the Sea Sage Effigy, a strange statue with an aquatic theme. While the Count was unable to provide any further information on the Way's efforts, he did manage to point the heroes in their direction. He suspected, and rightly so, that the cultists were making their way for Ascanor Lodge, deep within the Shudderwood. Speaking of, Auren Vrood was quite busy, even with the heroes of Ravengro hot on his heels. While he had succeeded in acquiring the Sea Sage Effigy, much work remained to be done. Luckily, the counties of Lozeri and Ardil contained 2 of the ingredients he sought. The first was indicated by the line shown here, "With Packlord's heart, the beast shall wake." This line proved to be fairly straightforward, as the Pack Lord's heart was a clear reference to the heart of a Pack Lord of the werewolves of the Shudderwood. The Pack Lord at the time was Kavalka Sane, but she had a few notable rivals. One of these rivals, Mathis Mordrenacht, the character who has the coolest name in this entire video by far, agreed to aid in the assassination of Kavalka in exchange for being allowed to consume part of her heart and become her successor. This plan went off without a hitch, at least for the cultists, who seized the portion of the heart they required, then continued on toward our deal. Mathis, however, found less success. Having consumed only a portion of Kavalka Sane's heart, the werewolf found his grasp on power tenuous at best. Most of the Shudderwood tribes refused to acknowledge his right to rule, leading to an all-out werewolf civil war. Into this powder keg stepped the heroes, who were forced to confront Mathis Mordrenacht and put him down. This put them back on the trail of the cultists, who they tracked to the ghost town of Feldgrau in the Furrows region of Ardale County. In Feldgrau, Auren Vrood had been hard at work again. His next task was to acquire the Skull of Splintered Graves, mentioned in this line, and Feldgrau was the perfect place to do just that. Feldgrau had been destroyed years ago, when an invading force had put the entire town's population to the sword and buried them in a mass grave. Vrood and his disciples had raised these corpses as an undead army, and had carefully harvested bone splinters from the skulls of each one. These splinters had been pieced together to craft a single amalgamated skull, which proved to be the required ingredient. Vrood himself sent this item, as well as the spirit of Warden Hawkran and the heart of Kavalka Sane, on to Caliphas, where Adivian Adrazant waited. Rather than continue on, however, Vrood elected to wait behind, to deal with the heroes who had become a thorn in his side. This proved to be a mistake, as the heroes dealt with him and his cultists in short order. That said, they were still faced with more loose ends. In addition to the items sent along to Vrood's master, whose identity and location they didn't know, the Sea Sage effigy had been sent instead to a town called Thrushmoor, and so the heroes set out, with plenty of mysteries yet to unravel. Unfortunately for both the heroes and for me, this is where things get very complicated very quickly. I'm going to cover this next section at an extremely zoomed out level, because Book 4 of Carrion Crown could pretty easily be split into 2 or even 3 books, with all its twists and turns. Very basically, the Whispering Way next sought the Chronicles of the Raven's Tongue, which they had discovered meant a holy weapon called the Raven's Head Mace, which had been lost at the bottom of Lake Encarthen years ago. Arriving in the town of Ilmarsh, the cultists of the Whispering Way made a deal with a tribe of scum in the region. That's S-K-U-M, not S-C-U-M. The cultists would locate and capture an artifact called the Face of Dagon and trade it for the Raven's Head Mace, which the scum would acquire from the lakebed. The Face of Dagon was nothing other than the Sea Sage effigy, which had been misidentified by scholars in Lepidstadt and which the cultists had used the Beast of Lepidstadt to steal. Returning to Ilmarsh with the Sea Sage effigy, the cultists made a terrifying discovery, however. The scum with whom they had made their deal had been contacted by a force of Mi-Go from the depths of the Dark Tapestry, who now sought to control the scum directly. Once again, it was up to the heroes to step into this viper's nest and sort the whole thing out. Arriving in Ilmarsh after passing through Thrushmoor, the heroes spent substantial amounts of time discovering and unraveling the various plots and counterplots in and around the town. After finally descending into the underwater scum caverns, the heroes were able to defeat the Mi-Go, the scum, and the various other threats and dangers arrayed against them. After seizing the Raven's Head Mace, the heroes then discovered a clue to their next destination. The Raven's Head had been intended to travel to Caliphas, where it would be delivered to Vrood's waiting master. Caliphas proves yet again to be a convoluted mess of plots and schemes, and after dealing with the deadly internal politics of the city's vampire population and thwarting the schemes of a pair of witches who worked for Ardrasant, the heroes finally pieced together the ultimate goal of their enemies. the restoration of the Whispering Tyrant by the forced transformation of Count Lucinian Galdana of Amans. The cultists and their leader Adrazant had fled Caliphas prior to the heroes' arrival, and were making their way toward their regional headquarters at Wrenchurch Abbey, having kidnapped the Count already. The finale of the Carrion Crown adventure path began with the heroes assaulting Wrenchurch Abbey deep within Virlich. Facing off against some of the strongest traps and guardians the way could bring to bear, the heroes eventually succeeded in defeating the Abbey's master, the Grey Friar, and freeing Count Galdana. The Count had been undergoing preparations for his dark transformation, but the intercession of the heroes prevented these processes from being complete. Realizing the true mastermind of the plot, Adivian Adrazant, had gone on ahead with the Carrion Crown elixir, the heroes were forced to follow him to his ultimate destination, Gallowspire. At Gallowspire, the heroes dodged or destroyed the various dangers and challenges which inhabited the ruins of Atarak. The greatest of these protectors was the Ravener Merogarth, who they eventually defeated with great difficulty. Ascending the steps of Gallowspire, the heroes prepared for the final confrontation with the true genius behind the Carrion Crown plot, Adivian Adrazant. Realizing that his plans would never come to fruition as he had hoped, Adrazant found himself overcome with desperation. Without Count Galdana, the elixir of the Carrion Crown lacked a host, and Adrazant had no chance against the powerful heroes who had bested his most competent followers. Out of options, the necromancer took the only action available to him. He consumed the Carrion Crown himself, hoping against hope that he might prove to be the true successor to the Whispering Tyrant after all. This hope proved misplaced. Adrazant found himself transformed, not into the Whispering Tyrant, but something far less elegant and controlled. The Carrion Crown elixir, intended for another host body and incomplete without the Raven's Head mace, twisted Adrazant's form into that of a forsaken Lich, a monstrosity representing a failed transformation or a miscalculation in the formula required to attain Lichdom. As a forsaken Lich, Adrazant was unable to leave Gallowspire, as without the incredible necromantic energy of the tower to sustain his broken form, he likely only had a few days until his body and soul were torn apart and destroyed. But he still presented a serious threat, as he likely had enough power and knowledge to eventually free Tar-Baphon, or at least cause some other serious damage. With their enemy stronger than he had ever been, the heroes finally reached the top of the tower and faced Adrazant. After a titanic struggle, Adrazant was defeated, his soul and form reduced to ash, and his well-laid plans shattered beyond repair. With Adrazant's defeat, the majority of the efforts of the Whispering Way in the region collapsed. Many among the cult had pinned their hopes upon the Carrion Crown, and the actions of the heroes had not only dashed these hopes, but had seriously impacted the cult's operational capacity in Ustalav. Wrenchurch, which had long been among the mightiest of the cult's fortified positions, had been cleared out, and many of the cult's more active higher-ups had been killed. This resulted in a substantial decrease in the Whispering Way's operations in Ustalav and Lastwall for several years, but it by no means spelled the end for their cult, or its Dark Master. Which takes us nicely to the events of Tyrant's Grasp. Another last chance spoiler warning here. I'm about to spoil the events of the Tyrant's Grasp adventure path in their entirety. If you want to skip this section, now's your chance. The next, and most recent, chapter in Tar-Baphon's story begins not long after the events of Carrion Crown. But before I get into that, I need to backtrack a bit. There's one character who I haven't mentioned yet, but who plays a pivotal role in the events of the Tyrant's Grasp AP. So, to provide the proper context, I need to rewind about 1400 years. Minor content warning here for a situation which might be construed as self-harm. During the Whispering Tyrant's initial conquest of Ustalav after his return as a Lich, the county of Grodlich was among the first to fall to his might. At the time, the ruler of Grodlich was Count Joma Gildeas, a second son who never expected to inherit any real responsibility and was thus unprepared for rulership when his father and brother died. When the tyrant led his armies to Grodlich, Count Gildeas resolved himself to lead his armies in response, an unexpected show of courage from a nobleman known for indecision and cowardice. When Count Gildeas faced the tyrant at the head of his armies, he demanded that the tyrant remove his forces, though his voice shook with fear. Amused, Tar-Baphon responded by opening a portal directly to the void, then hurling the screaming Count Gildeas in. The county of Grodlich fell soon after. Much later, Tar-Baphon saw fit to extract the count from his prison, to see what had become of the poor man. What he found surprised him. Joma Gildeas had been transformed by the powers of the void. Killed and restored to unlife, then infused with a frigid malice, the count had become a winterwight. Indulging in his own cruelty, the Whispering Tyrant declared that the count, who he named the Failure of House Gildeas, would thereafter serve as his seneschal. Joma, too terrified of his new master to refuse, accepted the position. For the next 500 years, the Count, whose name and title soon shortened to Gildeas, served loyally in Tar-Baphon's army. Any resistance he felt toward his captor was slowly broken through a combination of magical compulsion and emotional abuse, and before long, any thoughts of rebellion or disloyalty were long gone. Gildeas, as seneschal, was among the undead who were trapped in Gallowspire after Tar-Baphon was defeated by General Arnazant. As the tyrant raged against his servants and blamed them for his own failure, Gildeas retreated. He sought solitude and sank into a deep introspective depression. As he whiled away the years with his thoughts, he found himself overcome by regret for the terrible things he had done in Tar-Baphon's name. This confused him, as such feelings should have been beyond him as a winterwight. As regret turned to genuine remorse, Gildeas sought to purge himself of the taint of undeath, and the great seal, which locked Gallowspire, drew his eye. The seal radiated positive energy, and this radiation burned and seared away at the necromantic energy which clung to Gildeas's soul. And as time went on, Gildeas found that the seal's power hurt him less and less. Gildeas, however, was not the only person to make surprising discoveries during his imprisonment in Gallowspire. After his rage subsided, Tar-Baphon set himself to the task of securing his freedom. He began by hurling all the dark magic he could muster at the Great Seal, but this tactic proved fruitless. The tyrant slowly came to realize that, even if the 3 lesser seals were ever destroyed, it would take more than negative energy on its own to destroy the Great Seal. Other methods of escape proved equally useless, as the magic of the Great Seal had infused the very walls and floors of Gallowspire, preventing any attempts at tunneling to escape. This forced the tyrant to rethink his strategy and look into other topics of study. One topic which he found it difficult to ignore was the shattered shield of Arnazant, a shard of which was still embedded firmly in his hand. The shield still burned with incredibly intense positive energy, causing the tyrant immense pain. As analytical as ever, Tar-Baphon sought to understand this new situation, and he slowly unraveled the mysteries of the shield. Once called the Shield of Erodin, the shield had been crafted by the living god himself, and was enchanted to redirect any harmful energy toward the wielder into the shield itself. This was the effect which had caused Tar-Baphon's own wish spell to backfire and shatter the shield in the first place, with one of the shield's shards embedding itself into his outstretched palm as an ironic twist to the spell's intended effect. Curious about the magic which powered the shield, Tar-Baphon began to experiment. He unwove the magics which infused the shard in his hand, and pieced together the mechanics behind the artifact. This went on for years without much progress, but after centuries of study, he finally achieved a breakthrough. The tyrant discovered that he could target the shard with a blast of negative energy, and it would respond with a corresponding blast of positive energy, which was incrementally larger. This was useful, but the real breakthrough was his discovery that all the shards of Arnazant's shield were still connected to one another. With his connection to the shard in his hand, Tar-Baphon could feel the other shards, and could choose to direct the output of positive energy from his shard toward one of the remaining 11 shards outside of Gallowspire. That shard would, in turn, send a corresponding surge of increased negative energy back, feeding into his own shard. This created a magical feedback loop, allowing the tyrant to create a circuit of positive and negative energy which could quickly and easily exceed the energy which Tar-Baphon could bring to bear on his own. This was an incredible discovery, as Tar-Baphon now had a positive energy weapon which he could direct toward the Great Seal to ensure his freedom. He dubbed this weapon the Radiant Fire. The Radiant Fire did have a catch, however. The feedback loop which built up the weapon's incredible energy could only be released into one of the two shards used to create the loop. That shard would then be destroyed. Controlling which shard was destroyed was also a precise act, as a slight miscalculation might destroy the tyrant's own shard, which would vaporize his body and eliminate his ability to use the Radiant Fire in the future. Regardless, what the tyrant needed now was a way to position the remaining shards of the Shield of Arnazant in key positions around the world. Luckily for Tar-Baphon, an opportunity to do just that soon presented itself. By the 4700s, Gildeas found that the Great Seal no longer burned him at all. His remorse was so total and his repentance so genuine that the Great Seal, intended to block the maliciousness of the Whispering Tyrant, no longer had any effect on him. In 4711, he finally took a chance and passed through the Great Seal, escaping Gallowspire and gaining a chance at redemption. And watching all of this with delight was Tar-Baphon. Gildeas fled Gallowspire and spent several years undertaking various tasks in a quest for redemption. These efforts were at first unfocused, but as time went on, the former Count came up with an idea. He became convinced that if he could steal the remaining shards of the Shield of Arnazant, he would be able to deny the tyrant some powerful but unknown advantage, and thus do something good. What Gildeas failed to realize, however, was that this idea was not his own. Through years of magical compulsion and abuse, Tar-Baphon had established a tenuous but permanent psychic connection to his seneschal, not powerful enough to assert control, but certainly strong enough to implant basic ideas and drives. It was this connection which allowed the tyrant to implant the suggestion that Gildeas gather the fragments of the Shield of Arnazant, making the Winterwhite his unsuspecting agent. In 4717 AR, Gildeas hired a group of thieves called the 6 Wise Crows to steal 10 of the remaining 11 fragments of the shattered Shield of Arnazant, and replace them with replicas. At the same time, the Seneschal worked to cut a deal with the Sealbreakers in Vigil, led by the elf Yosiduin. The Sealbreakers, who presumably kept their allegiance to the tyrant secret from Gildeas, would keep an eye on the 6 Wise Crows and ensure that they maintained their secrecy. The planned theft soon went off without a hitch, and only a single shard was left behind in Vigil. The remaining shards were smuggled out of the city and handed off to agents of the Whispering Way, who, again, concealed their true allegiance from Gildeas. With the shield fragments now in the hands of his loyal agents, Tar-Baphon could feel his freedom creeping closer by the day. Of the 3 seals which protected the Great Seal, only the one beneath Vigil remained intact. The seal which had been passed to the dwarves of Kragodan had been independently destroyed in 4708 by the necromancer Drasmorg the Drudger, who located it beneath an abandoned dwarven fortress in the Fangwood Forest of Avestan. For more information on that, check out the Hungry Are the Dead adventure. It's a follow-up to the popular Crown of the Kobold King. The seal entrusted to Taldor, meanwhile, had been taken farther away, and was eventually hidden beneath Kaer Maga. It was discovered and destroyed by agents of the Way in 4717, leaving the seal beneath Vigil as the only one in need of destruction. I won't go into any more detail here for fear of spoiling another popular AP. As the hour of his freedom drew near, Tar-Baphon felt his anticipation growing, and hope took root within his dead heart for the first time in centuries. But the tyrant had developed more than one psychic connection over the years, and thousands of miles away, someone was listening, and she felt the tyrant's hope, and heard the dark whispers in his mind. This all set into motion the events of the Tyrant's Grasp adventure path. On a calm night in 4719, the small town of Rosler's Coffer on the Lastwall frontier was incinerated in an instant. One moment it was there, and the next it was consumed in an immense conflagration of positive and negative energy. The lives of the entire population were snuffed out, and not a single soul had any inkling of what happened. Unprepared for this instantaneous surge of souls, the psychopomps who serve Pharasma shunted the souls of the citizens of Rosler's Coffer into a holding location in the boneyard. 4 of these souls, however, became isolated from the rest. Some quirk of their makeup made them unique, and the psychopomps were unsure of how to deal with them. These individuals were the heroes of the Tyrant's Grasp adventure path, and their souls had become irreversibly infused with a strange magical mote of energy called an obol. The heroes eventually struck a deal with a pair of local psychopomps, who explained that the heroes were not, in fact, dead. Their souls had simply been separated from their bodies. Unlike the other citizens of Rosler's Coffer, the PCs somehow survived the disaster which befell their town, and were, for reasons they could not explain, now oddly resistant to void energy. These psychopomps showed the heroes to the dead roads, the passages which servants of Pharasma used to travel from the boneyard to the material plane. After traversing the dead roads, the heroes were able to return home, determined to discover just what had happened to the town they left behind. Emerging into Rosler's Coffer, the heroes made a terrifying discovery. The town had been rendered nearly unrecognizable. Unbeknownst to the heroes, Rosler's Coffer had been selected as the testing ground for Tar-Baphon's radiant fire. An agent of the Whispering Way had smuggled one of the shards of the Shield of Arnazant into the town. Then Tar-Baphon had triggered the weapon from within Gallowspire at only a fraction of its full power. The resulting blast had been catastrophic. The radiant fire had sent out a wave of overwhelming vitality, or positive energy, which scoured the landscape and incinerated all life in its path. A wave of void energy, its negative counterpart, followed, infusing the land with necromantic power. The interaction between these two forces resulted in an irradiated wasteland, with magical effects which were difficult to explain. The entire town had been annihilated. As the heroes returned to the wasteland they had once called home, they discovered something equally unexpected. The whole region was under occupation. The Whispering Way had moved in and now controlled the town. Curious to the Way's motivations, the heroes investigated, eventually culminating in a fight with the mission leader for the Way. I just want to take a brief aside here and mention that this boss fight is awesome, as the heroes are forced to fight their own former bodies, which were reanimated as zombies to fight them. When they emerged from the dead roads, new bodies had been generated for them on the material plane. I'm not sure I fully understand the metaphysical stuff going on here, but the fight is just too cool not to mention. After dealing with the Whispering Way cultists, the heroes were finally able to piece together some of what had happened. They realized that the Way now had access to a powerful superweapon, and that the weapon was responsible for the destruction of the town, though the specifics of how it worked remained beyond them. They were also confronted by a stranger in a dark red cloak. The stranger, a woman from a foreign land, tasked them with traveling to Vigil and reporting what had happened, alerting the Knights of Ozem to the danger presented by the new weapon. She also warned the heroes to maintain a watchful eye and keep a lookout for the activities of someone called Gildeus. Traveling to Vigil, the heroes attempted to convince the leaders of the Knights of Ozem to investigate the fate of Rosler's Coffer. While they succeeded in making a small amount of headway, they ultimately failed to convince the knights to drop what they were doing and take the threat to Vigil seriously. Undeterred, the heroes took it upon themselves to investigate further. Asking around about the mysterious Gildeus, the heroes eventually tracked down the operations of the 6 wise crows, but not before the crows themselves were killed by the Sealbreakers operating in Vigil. Delving into the depths of the city, the heroes eventually confronted the Sealbreakers and their captain, Yosiduin, in a forgotten subterranean temple to Arazni. Though the heroes succeeded in defeating Yosiduin, they failed to act quickly enough to bring any proof to the knights. As the heroes tried to return to the surface, an explosion of tremendous scale racked the city above. Vigil had been targeted by the full force of the Radiant Fire, the remaining shard of Arnazant in the Crusaders' War College having been used as ammunition to fuel the blast. In addition to obliterating the Knights' base of operations at Castle Overwatch, the explosion had also succeeded in destroying the lesser seal contained beneath the college. Thousands were incinerated in an instant, and even more lives were lost in the ensuing chaos. Emerging from their coincidental safety below ground, the heroes immediately joined the rescue efforts. They were forced to fight several monstrous creatures drawn to the city as a result of the blast, but were ultimately successful in loading hundreds of civilians onto ships bound for nearby Castle Everstand in an impromptu evacuation. While traveling downriver, the heroes were contacted by a mysterious creature, a golem serving the strange woman in the red cloak with whom they had conversed earlier. Following the golem's invitation, the heroes eventually met the woman at her magically concealed base of operations, where she revealed her terrifying and incredible identity. Arazni, the Red Crusader who had died at the hands of Tar-Baphon. For a detailed version of Arazni's story, check out my Pathfinder Deities video on her, but for our purposes, here's the short version. After the Knights of Ozem laid her to rest, Arazni's corpse remained in state for more than 60 years, until it was stolen by Grave Knights from Geb, in retribution for the Knights having tried to overthrow him. Geb toiled for a year and a day over Arazni's body until he eventually forced her soul back to the material plane as a Lich. Using a combination of direct control through her soul cage and emotional manipulation, Geb forced Arazni to become his queen, a position she unwillingly held for more than 800 years. While both the Knights of Ozem and Erodin knew of the woman's fate, neither succeeded in freeing her, and the Knights of Ozem even took to calling her the Harlot Queen. Arazni fostered the hate in her heart and thought she might never be able to free herself. Then, a few years ago, she felt something. A glimmer of hope, not from herself, but from an ancient and hated enemy. Arazni discovered a psychic link between her and Tar-Baphon, the Lich who had slain her, and through this link she learned that he had been planning his escape. Fleeing her nation, Arazni arrived in Rosler's coffer just in time to be consumed in its destruction. She reformed at the site of her soul cage, but the process was slower and more painful than it had ever been before. Realizing that the Radiant Fire had somehow disturbed her connection to her soul cage, Arazni returned with haste to the ruins of the town, where she recognized something strange about the souls of the heroes. Now, with the destruction of Vigil, she realized that the time for secrecy had finally come to an end. Arazni revealed to the heroes that, not long after the destruction of Vigil, Gallowspire, the prison which had contained the Whispering Tyrant for nearly 1,000 years, had been incinerated. Tar-Baphon, the mightiest necromancer in history, was free. Arazni then declared that she could stop the tyrant if she could get close enough to attack, but the witch gates prevented her from teleporting close, and traveling by land would make her vulnerable to being tracked by both the tyrant himself and the agents of Geb who were hunting her. She asked the heroes to travel to Gallowspire and explore its depths, to find the controls to the tyrant's witchgate network and disable them so she might be able to teleport through Virlich again. The heroes, not prepared to refuse an undead demigoddess from legend, complied. They traveled to Gallowspire and plumbed its deepest levels. There they confronted and defeated 4 of the Grave Knights responsible for capturing Arazni and returning her to Geb. They also managed to find and deactivate the controls for the Witchgate network. Receiving new orders from Erasni, the heroes used the Witch Gates to travel to Wrenchurch Abbey, where the tyrant was marshalling his forces. Erasni followed the PCs, using the obols within their souls to track and teleport right to them. She then set out to face Tar-Baphon in single combat, asking the heroes to delay the appearance of an oncoming army of the Knights of Ozem. The heroes ultimately succeeded in forcing the knights to retreat, and Watcher Lord Ulthun was convinced to recall his forces rather than throw away their lives. Erasni, however, was unable to defeat Tar-Baphon. Realizing that his necromantic magic was ineffective against Erasni's Lich form, the tyrant, regretfully, resorted to using the Radiant Fire, teleporting away as Erasni was consumed. This, though, was all according to Erasni's plan. Her goal all along had been to take a direct hit from the Radiant Fire, as she had targeted herself with all manner of wards to enhance the weapon's destructive potential. As her form burned away, she felt the connection between her and her soul cage sever, and she hoped that she might finally rest in peace. But in the moment of her death, she came to a realization. She had an affection for the PCs, and considered them her friends. She didn't want them to be destroyed in the blast which took her life. What's more, she realized then that the magic obols tied to their souls reminded her of something from her ancient past, from before she even became Eredin's herald. In a last desperate act, Erasni teleported the heroes out of the blast zone, sending them to safety in the land of her birth, all the way across the planet to Jopatl in Arcadia. She left them a single hint to her ultimate goal: investigate the Kumaru. Understandably, the heroes were quite confused at this turn of events. They found themselves near the city of Jolispan, and, after a period of adjustment, soon settled into the town. They made contact with a magical botanist named Miraina Olviris, who explained where they were, then took notice of the obols connected to their souls. Miraina immediately began to draw connections between the obols and the mythical Kumaru tree, which she and her people had revered for generations. After the heroes aided in repelling an attack on the city, Miraina eventually succeeded in unraveling the mystery of the obols. But to understand this part of the story, I need to backtrack a bit. Thousands of years ago, prior to Eredin's ascension to godhood, the last Aslanti heard tell of the strange and powerful magics of far-off Jopatl. Arriving in Jolispan, he was astounded by the ley line network which the locals called the Veins of Creation, and the mythical Kumaru tree which formed its nexus. As a stranger, he was denied access to the tree, but this changed with the arrival of a wizard named Erasni. The two arcanists worked together on a research proposal, which eventually earned them limited, supervised access to the Kumaru tree within the legendary Tumbaha mountain. The pair of wizards researched together, and quickly made several breakthroughs which Erasni was eager to put to use in helping her countrymen. Eredin joined her in this effort, and the pair ventured across Jopatl for many years. When they finally returned to Jolispan, they were greeted as heroes, and after successfully defending the city from an encroaching warlord, they were granted unrestricted access to the Kumaru tree. This access was what Eredin had been hoping for, and he studied the tree for several more years with Erasni at his side. She eventually departed, content in the knowledge she had gained, but the last Aslanti remained. Working alone, he undertook increasingly intense experiments, until he finally implanted a piece of his own soul into the tree itself. This gave him a mastery of the Veins of Creation which was heretofore thought impossible. Using this newfound power, he forced the tree to grow a single branch, which twisted several times upon itself. He then severed this branch, and used it to craft the Shield of Eredin, a weapon intrinsically connected to his own soul, but which existed independently of his own power, and which only he could repair each time it was broken. His objective complete, Eredin departed from Jopatl. The Kumaru tree survived for millennia, an impossible lifespan for even a mystical tree. It was only in 4606 AR, when Eredin and the tree died at the same instant, that the local botanists realized that the god's soul had been sustaining the tree for all those years. But, upon Eredin's death, the Veins of Creation, which formed the backbone of society in Jopatl, ceased to function. This was far worse than what would have happened if the Kumaro tree had died a natural death, as it could have been replaced with new saplings. But with the dead fragment of Erodin's soul still clinging to the tree, the whole ley line network was corrupted, leaving it functionally useless. For the 100 years after Erodin's death, Xopotl experienced a drastic and steady decline, and Erodin quickly went from a local hero to a despised villain among the native peoples. With the arrivals of the heroes in Jolispan, however, Miraina felt an inkling of hope for her people and their lost magics. She was able to identify the obols within their souls for what they truly were, metaphysical fragments of the Kumaru tree, splinters of the shattered shield of Arnazant which had burst from the shield shard which had been detonated in Rosler's coffer. These splinters had pierced the heroes to their very souls, infusing them with the life-giving energy of the veins of creation. There were 3 key takeaways from this information. First, Miraina pointed out that the energy within the heroes was still very much alive, making them the first living source of Kumaru energy in the region since the death of Erodin. She theorized that the heroes might finally be able to plant new Kumaru seeds and reactivate the ley line network, driving the remains of Erodin's dead soul from the veins of creation once and for all, and freeing the people of Xopotl from their century of decline. Second, Miraina confirmed that the obols could never be safely removed from the heroes' souls. The damage to their souls was too extensive to survive without the power of the obols, and any attempt to remove them would inevitably end in death. Miraina's third point, however, was far more relevant to the story of Tar-Baphon. The botanist theorized that she might be able to reverse the polarity of the obols within the heroes, switching them from suppressing negative energy to enhancing positive energy. In addition to being a fun mechanical change from which the characters could benefit, this would have an additional effect. If the heroes were targeted by the radiant fire, the obols within their souls would inversely attune to the source of the fire and send it careening back where it came from. In short, they would add another node to Tar-Baphon's feedback loop at the very end of the cycle, throwing off his calculations and control and forcing him to accidentally detonate the shard embedded within his own hand. Unfortunately, this would do nothing to save the heroes from destruction, as their obols would be immediately overloaded by the radiant fire, and they would be annihilated in totality, their bodies vaporized and their souls incinerated to the point of non-existence. The heroes wouldn't even have the dignity of an afterlife, as not enough soul would remain for even Pharasma herself to judge. With this information, the heroes had a path forward. By sacrificing themselves to Tar-Baphon's radiant fire, they could destroy the weapon once and for all. Though this was hardly the happy ending they might have hoped for, it gave them a chance at stopping the greatest threat the world had seen in 10,000 years. Before that, though, they had more work to do in Xopotl. Miraina wasn't the only person who knew about Erodin's meddling with the Kumaru tree. Tar-Baphon had discovered that secret during his centuries-long imprisonment. Upon his escape, he sent one of his most loyal servants, the Ravener Istravek, who he had captured all those years ago, to Xopotl to secure the tree. His hope was to have the dragon study the tree and to discover more of its secrets, in the hopes of learning more about the radiant fire and the shield of Erodin. This plan came crashing down, however, when Istravek arrived at Tumbaha Mountain and discovered the mythical tree was dead. Determined to reignite the veins of creation, the hero set out for Tumbaha Mountain and confronted Istravek. With difficulty, they defeated the ancient dragon, finally ending the suffering of the children of Karamoros. They then worked with the botanists of Jolispan to plant and infuse new seedlings of the Kumaru tree. These took root quickly with some magical encouragement, and the veins of creation surged with life for the first time in more than a century. Back in Avestan, while the heroes were dealing with the whole Xopotl situation, Tar-Baphon had been hard at work. With his initial goals achieved, those being the destruction of Lastwall and his escape from Gallowspire, he then moved on to the second and final stage of his plan. Too many times had the tyrant been vexed by the gods. Too many times had the machinations of the gods, and particularly Erodin, gotten in his way and stopped his rise to power. No longer. If the gods saw fit to interfere in his realm, then he would do the same to them. To that end, he planned to gather his forces and march on Absalom, where he would conquer the Starstone Cathedral and claim divinity for himself. I'll be honest, in terms of plans, I like it. While the tyrant could have simply teleported to the Isle of Kortos and used the Radiant Fire to wipe Absalom from the map, he feared what the weapon might do to the Starstone, or how it might interact with the artifact's bizarre magic. So he was forced to rely on more rudimentary tools, in this case several armies of undead minions. To acquire these armies, the tyrant made his way to one of the ancient vaults in which he had preserved entire legions during the time of the Shining Crusade. This particular vault was located beneath the Lastwall fortress of Hammer Rock, which Tar-Baphon simply annihilated with another blast of radiant fire. Arriving in his ancient vault, however, the necromancer made a frustrating discovery. The Lich he had left in charge had sunk into despondency in the intervening years, and the 3 legions under his command had fallen into disarray and senseless infighting. Enraged, but still very much in a hurry, Tar-Baphon gathered his available forces from the surrounding lands and transported them via magic to the Isle of Kortos. He ordered the 3 remaining armies within the Hammer Rock Vault to rapidly organize themselves, at which point they would join him via magic as his reinforcements. Tar-Baphon and his initial forces first arrived in the Cairnlands region of the Isle of Kortos, putting them north and east of Absalom. The city quickly raised the alarm, and soon whole legions of allied troops from Osirian and the Five Kings Mountains, as well as ragtag collections of adventurers from around the world, had arrived and formed up to defend the city at the center of the world. The ensuing clash of armies would occupy Tar-Baphon's time for the next several days. Meanwhile, the PCs returned via magic to Lastwall, where they coordinated with the surviving leaders of the Knights of Ozem. They made their way to Hammer Rock and discovered the destroyed fortress as well as the chaotic mess within the hidden vault below. Determined to sow chaos and disrupt the tyrant's plans, the heroes entered the vault and hunted down the leaders of the 3 armies. By destroying the leadership structure within the vault, the heroes succeeded in denying Tar-Baphon his reinforcements, and even managed to convince Gildeus, who had been desperately seeking some proper cause through which he might finally obtain redemption, to betray his master. Having done all they could to stall the conquest, the heroes then teleported to the Cairnlands. They met up with the leaders of Absalom's defense forces, then worked with them to develop a plan. The heroes would undertake a strategy of irritation, taking on highly visible missions intended to needle at Tar-Baphon's patience by picking targets which he would find difficult to ignore. This took the form of assassination missions against high-level threats within the tyrant's army, as well as flashier missions intended to counter major troop movements. These missions soon had the desired effect, and Tar-Baphon resorted to unleashing the Horns of Naraga upon the heroes. These horns, stolen from the daughter of Karamoros thousands of years ago, still retained an echo of their previous form, and transformed into a powerful black dragon to hunt and kill the heroes. And soon Tar-Baphon found himself unwilling to play around any longer. When the heroes were engaging some of the leaders of the Absalom defenses, the Lich King struck. Backed up by a powerful undead minion, the Whispering Tyrant sought to destroy the heroes himself. He assaulted their position, using a wish spell to obliterate the building around them, and hurled his most powerful spells against them. The tyrant hadn't counted on the obols, however, which made the heroes resistant to the powers of the void, and allowed them to survive many of his spells. Finally, having had enough, the necromancer fell back to his ultimate weapon. Raising his hand, the tyrant unleashed the Radiant Fire. And with that, his fate was sealed. The Radiant Fire rebounded into the shard in his own hand, consuming the tyrant himself in an explosion of positive and negative energy. All about him was consumed in flame and destruction, creating an immense crater in the Cairnlands. His armies on the Isle of Kortos were nearly wiped out in an instant, along with most of their leadership structure. The heroes themselves were obliterated, with even their souls ceasing to exist. Though they had no future in the hereafter, they died knowing they had saved the world and removed the threat of the Radiant Fire from existence. In the days following the explosion, the defenders of Absalom cleaned up the remaining forces of the tyrant, destroying them entirely or driving them into the Cairnlands. The heroes were memorialized with statues in the foreign quarter of Absalom, and an annual festival was declared in their honor. The tyrant himself reformed from his soul cage and returned to activity on Golarion, but retreated to the Isle of Terror with his most loyal followers. Notably, his left hand was no longer pierced by a shard of the shield of Eredin, and the radiant fire had been taken from him forever. Back on the Isle of Kortos, the center of the crater where the tyrant had died earned a terrifying reputation. Rumors swirled that a single dead hand could still be found there, desperately clinging to the rock at the crater's center with an unbreakable death grip. This earned the whole place a new name in the common parlance: the Tyrant's Grasp. Activities since 2E. The Tyrant's Grasp adventure path marked the end of the Pathfinder narrative in 1st edition, but it didn't mark the end of the story. Since the start of Pathfinder 2E in 2019, the tale of Tar-Baphon and his allies and enemies has added several chapters and introduced more than a few new and interesting characters. By far, the most interesting and consequential development in this story was the return of Erasni as a full goddess. Erasni's destruction, via the Radiant Fire, succeeded in severing her connection to her soul cage, freeing her from the control of Geb forever. Then, the unexpected happened. She rose again, more powerful than ever. Imbued with divine power, Erasni took on the mantle of the Unyielding, becoming a goddess of vengeance, spite, and pride. Erasni became somewhat unique among the gods due to her active hatred for specific mortals on Golarion, namely Geb and Tar-Baphon. She directed her followers to oppose them at every turn. On a more material scale, the nation of Lastwall quickly fell after Tar-Baphon's escape from Gallowspire. The Knights of Ozem organized as much of an evacuation as they could, pulling refugees into Ustalav, Nirmathas, Multhun, and numerous other nations in the region. The land which made up Lastwall was quickly conquered by Tar-Baphon's forces, which rapidly sprung up, seemingly from nowhere, to fill the gap left by the fleeing refugees. Lastwall as a nation rapidly collapsed, and the territory was quickly renamed to the Gravelands. This effectively became the successor state to Tar-Baphon's former kingdom in the region, and forces from the Gravelands presented serious threats to its neighboring nations, including Ustalav to the north. The Knights of Ozem were forced to reckon with their complete and total failure in the face of Tar-Baphon's return. While many of the knights struggled to come to terms with this disaster, even more resolved themselves to redefine their purpose in the world. The tattered remains of the knights renamed themselves the Knights of Lastwall, and declared that they would restore their lost nation and defeat the tyrant and his forces once and for all. The Knights of Lastwall took up a series of missions all over Avestan, from rescuing refugees from behind enemy lines, to bolstering the defenses of nations neighboring the tyrant's territory, to even attacks of both large and small scale on the tyrant's most dangerous forces. Undertaking the most dangerous and aggressive of these missions were the Crimson Reclaimers, an order among the knights whose members saw the only path toward victory as an aggressive and merciless strategy of terror and violence behind enemy lines. Each member of the Crimson Reclaimers swore the Crimson Oath, a magical incantation of mysterious origin. Unbeknownst to most of the knights, Erasni herself was the source of the oath, and her followers were common among the Reclaimers. Moving on to Tar-Baphon himself, the defeated necromancer quickly established a new seat of power for himself on the Isle of Terror. Arriving on the island, he was almost immediately attacked by an unexpected and ancient enemy, Karamoros, the former master of Intiper Isle. Karamoros had returned from the void as a ravener, and her rage at the loss of her children burned as bright as ever. She threw herself at the tyrant without hesitation, but he repelled her with relative ease. The Ravener then retreated to a hidden lair on the Isle of Terror. She then struck a bargain with the Nightwing Jolanera to aid her in discovering some weakness of the tyrant which she might exploit in the future. Jolanera, for her part, resolved to try and play the Tyrant and the Ravener against each other, so she might negotiate a better position for herself. After consolidating power on the Isle of Terror and in the Gravelands, the Whispering Tyrant sought to bolster his forces, so he might begin conquering territory once again. He sent messengers to the hold of Belkzen to call the orcs to arms, assuming they would come back to his side like the trained dogs he thought they were. He hadn't anticipated the rise of Ardax the Whitehair. Ardax, as the Lord of Urgir, captured these messengers, mounted their heads on spikes, and sent their decapitated corpses back to the tyrant, declaring that he and his people would never again kneel to the necromancer. In response, Tar-Baphon raised an undead army to bring the orcs to heel. Ardax was not so easily deterred, however. He rallied multiple orc tribes to his banner, and succeeded in crushing the undead invaders at the Battle of the Nine Broken Skulls in 4719. This represented a significant miscalculation on the part of the Whispering Tyrant, since, in addition to losing his army in the field, he also managed to unify the many disparate tribes of Belkzen under Ardax the Whitehair. While most of the nations around Lake Carthen quickly allied themselves against the Whispering Tyrant and his forces, Razmirin proved to be the exception. The living god Razmir quickly announced an alliance between himself and Tar-Baphon, much to the dismay of the leaders of Ustalav, who found themselves facing enemies on two sides. Interestingly, the leader of the Red Mantis assassins, Blood Mistress Jacqueline, recently announced to the public that someone in Razmirin had attempted to take out a contract on Tar-Baphon. That said, she failed to mention if the contract might eventually be accepted, or who exactly had initiated the contract in the first place. While many of Tar-Baphon's plans remain known only to the tyrant himself, it's an open secret that he has substantial interest in the final blades of Galt. These magical guillotines have trapped the souls of thousands of victims over many years of use, making them incredibly powerful artifacts imbued with potentially volatile undead energies. Several agents of the Whispering Way have dispatched to Galt to investigate these artifacts further, with the ultimate goal being the relocation of at least one of the blades to the Gravelands, or the Isle of Terror. Before I leave this section, I should also address the topic of loose ends. This story contains probably dozens of loose ends which might never be addressed again in the lore. Rather than think of these as dropped plot points, however, I see these as great opportunities for stories at your table. Many of Tar-Baphon's lieutenants, for instance, simply haven't been mentioned in any new publications since the start of 2E. The vampire lord General Malleus has likely reported to his master on the Isle of Terror, and is just as likely preparing an invasion of Ustalav from Castle Cronquist. Socorro, the Butcher of Carrion Hill, has yet to re-emerge in the Age of Lost Omens, and a Lich of his power could easily make a splash on the battlefield, or could make new and interesting necromantic discoveries. Dysane, the Mistress of the Gardens of Lead, hasn't left her position in her beloved gardens, and whether she is delighted or terrified at the tyrant's return is anyone's guess. Geir, the Master Scholar of Gasterhall, hasn't been mentioned so far in the Lost Omens books, but he is likely searching desperately for his missing translation of the Necronomicon. Erumhel, the Lord of Morgues, has yet to emerge from the Darklands, though he is desperately seeking a way to take his own shot at attaining divinity, so he might continue his fight with Iomedae. Finally, Kothos of Mekatar and his precious Key of Geb have vanished from the narrative at this point, but I suspect he has taken up residence either in the Gravelands or on the Isle of Terror. These are only several loose threads which players or GMs could easily pick up, and there are plenty more. For players interested in playing characters who follow Tar-Baphon, or who are members of the Whispering Way, here are a few useful details. For those using the alignment rules, members of the Whispering Way are almost universally evil, though a tendency toward law or chaos seems to come down to a follower's personal preference. Common personal edicts among the cult's members likely include to pursue undeath, and especially lichdom, to work toward bringing about a dead world, to seek personal power through necromancy, and to support the goals of the Whispering Tyrant. Conversely, personal anathema among cult members likely include to show mercy to living creatures or to reveal or write down the secrets of the Whispering Way. The relatively broad tenets of the Way allow for a wide variety of potential adherents and followers. From an appearance perspective, the Whispering Way presents no requirements to its members, meaning they can and will dress in whatever way they choose. In areas where the cult is acting in secret, they will likely tend toward nondescript clothing, but might have small indicators of their secret allegiance, like reversed holy symbols of Pharasma, tattoos under their clothing, or pins or brooches which hide symbols of undeath or necromancy. Undead members in these regions will likely need to hide their appearance using magic, makeup, alchemical reagents, or similar means. In areas where the cult is openly active, like the nation of Geb or the Gravelands, members will generally be much more bold in their choice of clothing. They might wear bright red robes evocative of blood, or embroider their clothing with imagery evocative of bones or necromantic runes. Followers who employ armor might favor skeletal designs. Religious members who worship gods of undeath will likely display their holy symbols prominently on their person. Similar to clothing, choice of weapons among the adherents of the Whispering Way is a broad and deeply personal choice on the part of followers. The tendency of members of the cult to be casters leads to the prominence of simple weapons like daggers or magical staves among members. Similarly, weapons of religious significance are notably prominent as well. These might include scythes for Urgathoa or Xiphas, the mace for Orcus, the rapier for Zura, the flail for Cabriri, or the naginata for Fumeoshi. Beyond that, martial weapons are likely more common among characters who take on the function of foot soldiers, guards, or grave knights. Though it's worth noting, I don't know of any official way for players to play grave knights in specific. Class-wise, necromancer wizards and cloistered clerics of deities of undeath are the most prominent classes among the members of the Whispering Way. These are the classes with the closest thematic tie to the pursuit of lichdom, which is traditionally an academically rigorous and magically complex process. At the same time, other casters with a connection to necromancy could fit this role nearly as well. These might include the Bones Mystery Oracle or the Undead Bloodline Sorcerer. Even bards can serve well within the Order's ranks, using their inspirational dirges to win over new members or empower skeletal legions in the field. It might also be fun to play a more martially focused caster to play a less conventional necromancer, like a magus, undead eidolon summoner, or war priest cleric. Martial characters can rise to prominence among the cult as well, though they are often limited to support roles in service of characters like Tar-Baphon, unless they put special emphasis on the performance of rituals. Fighters, evil champions, rangers with undead companions, or spirit instinct barbarians could all perform well, though really basically any martial class could excel. For instance, in regions where the cult must operate in secret, the rogue or investigator would be invaluable, while the thaumaturge would be appreciated anywhere for its mastery of obscure and ancient lore. The Undead Master and Corpse Tender archetypes could both perform well among the Way, as could the Reanimator. And for those of you looking for thematic familiars, the Talking Skull, Old Friend, Polong, or Crawling Hand familiars could all be great choices for members of the Whispering Way. The ancestral makeup of the Whispering Way is incredibly diverse, due to the organization's global reach and long history. Humans are common among their ranks, but members of practically any ancestry in Avestan and beyond can theoretically be found in their membership. As common as any one ancestry, however, are the undead character options from the Book of the Dead. Lichdom is seen as the ultimate goal of many members of the Whispering Way, but other options like skeletons, zombies, or mummies are relatively common as well. Vampires and ghouls are found among the organization too, though, as mentioned earlier, they might have issues with the organization's goal of a dead world, as it would leave them without a reliable source of food. Characters who are members of the Whispering Way tend toward megalomania, and selfishly seek to acquire power and knowledge. They actively work toward the end of all life, and seek to advance their own standing in the resulting undead society. While nearly all members are extremely self-important and arrogant, believing in their own inherent superiority, the means by which this core personality quirk can manifest among members is quite varied. Many can be deeply hedonistic, seeking undeath only to ensure their own continued existence and pleasure. Others might be more academic, seeing the pursuit of undeath as a growing field of study to which they can contribute. Still others might suffer from what I call Seymour Guado syndrome, believing that the end of all life would bring about the end of all suffering. And then, of course, there are the religious fanatics, devoted in their entirety to one of the many gods worshipped by the Way. My point is, if playing Agents of the Whispering Way appeals to you and your gaming group, you can still have differing motivations among party members, allowing for interesting roleplay, even among nominal allies. For GMs looking to integrate the Whispering Way and Tar-Baphon into a campaign, here are some ideas. First things first, Paizo has recently announced an upcoming adventure which is closely tied to everything I've discussed here. The soon-to-be-released Claws of the Tyrant adventure anthology will actually be 3 separate, smaller adventures taking place in and around the Gravelands region in Avestan. One of these adventures will put the PCs in the roles of Agents of the Whispering Way, while the other 2 will apparently be more conventional heroic storylines. I look forward to seeing what Paizo has planned in this collection of adventures. Until then, though, here are a few additional ideas I've put together. The Whispering Way is tremendously useful as a tool for GMs, as it has a far geographic reach and its members span a wide range of power levels. Low-level parties can encounter cultists taking on small-scale crimes, like grave robbing, conducting illicit research, or stealing valuable artifacts. As PCs increase in level, they might encounter higher-level dangers presented by the Way, mass murders, sacrificial rites, or rituals to raise powerful undead minions. At the highest levels, PCs might even be able to destroy undead armies, save entire cities, or topple local churches of undead deities who are tied to the Whispering Way. While the greatest and mightiest villain in the Whispering Way is inarguably the Whispering Tyrant himself, the organization's loose structure allows for the rise of all manner of memorable villains, who are extraordinarily powerful and impactful in their own right. The Way is widespread and dispersed enough that a charismatic and powerful member could easily travel to a region where they could become functionally independent, and act for all intents and purposes like the big bad among the Way in that region. In addition to the lieutenants of the Tyrant I mentioned earlier who could fill this role, I also want to mention Lysithea Sauroscythe, a pallid angel who serves at the command of Urgathoa. Another example of such a villain might include Princess Misoivel, an elf-turned-vampire who has taken command of one of the castles in the Gravelands and employs a group of Lashunta vampire bodyguards. Speaking of the Gravelands, they make for an excellent setting for a campaign, assuming your group doesn't mind constantly dealing with undead foes. In addition to the basic hook of having a whole nation filled with violent undead, the rapid evacuation of Lastwall left plenty of interesting features behind which could make for fun and fascinating set pieces or MacGuffins. Many of the relics I discussed in this video were likely lost during the fall of Vigil, and might make tempting prizes to be claimed by heroes and villains alike. On the larger scale, whole cities, villages, forts, and even castles were completely abandoned by the citizens of Lastwall. These make excellent haunting settings for players to explore, be they simply passing through an empty town on the road, or stalking a powerful undead enemy in an abandoned fort at night. With that broad generalization out of the way, let's get a bit more specific. While the Whispering Way is most active in Avestan, and specifically in the area around the Isle of Dread, the organization is global in its reach. Agents of the cult can be found all over Golarion, and they have their fingers in a huge number of pies. In Osirian, for instance, cult members might still be found excavating ancient tombs beneath the sands, seeking the secrets of the ancient pharaohs and the mummification they practiced. They might be following up on some of the loose plot threads from the Mummy's Mask AP, or some other secret of the mummies of ancient Osirian. One fun idea might be for these secrets to be hidden in the 4 remaining hidden sky pyramids of Hakotep I. Further south, on the edges of the Screaming Jungle in the Mwangi Expanse, the nation of Mazali is ruled by the deathless child Walkenna. Walkenna, a reanimated mummy, is tremendously powerful and is leading his country in a resurgence of nationalism and xenophobia. The Whispering Way might be working toward gaining influence with Walkenna or uncovering the secrets of his mummification, but will likely need to operate entirely through agents of Mwangish descent, as Walkenna is deeply xenophobic against all outsiders. Alternatively, the Way might need to operate entirely in secret, as Walkenna and his operatives might never accept them or their influence within his territory. Back to the north, in Isgr, the House of Lost Souls orphanage is the perfect setting for a smaller-scale tragedy. The orphanage is run by the despondent Docilia Mirinder, who seeks to provide a better life for the many needy children who come to her door. Isgr is a harsh country, however, and resources are scarce. Many children are in need of food or medicine which Docilia struggles to provide, a fact which pushes her deeper and deeper into the clutches of depression. Into this situation walked Aureledara, a powerful vampire in a child's body. Posing as a child in need of refuge, this wicked necromancer and member of the Way twisted Docilia's grief. As Aureledara claims, would death not be a sweet release for the poor children who needlessly suffer from hunger or disease in the House of Lost Souls? I really like this setup, and it plays really well against PCs who are followers of Cayden Carrion due to his association with orphans. On the other side of the world, in Chuye, in the middle of Tiansha, agents of Fumeyoshi are attempting to raise an army of corpses from the local rebel forces, known as the Mizuki Hikari. To advance these goals, followers of Fumeyoshi might reach out to the local agents of the Whispering Way to engineer a means of sacrificing enough rebel agents to form the first ranks of this undead army. This setting has the advantage of putting operatives of the Way on antagonistic terms with Chuye's ruling Oni, allowing for some very fun combat situations, where good aligned PCs might find themselves pitting one enemy against another. In Minkai, the young cultist Takakazu Ikeda has twisted his faith in Naderi, the goddess of tragic love. He seeks to lure vulnerable people into his influence, then twist their hearts and minds until they take their own lives out of grief and hopelessness. While his activities have been mostly local in scope thus far, he seeks to begin traveling all across Minkai, taking his operation to a national scale. No word yet on how this plotline might interact with the recent rise of Empress Ameko Amaterasu and her sweeping Ondori reformations. Taking a look back at Avestan, a GM might draw inspiration from Tar-Baphon's involvement with Zutha and the Rune Lords of Gluttony. The specifics of what the Whispering Tyrant stole from Zutha aren't entirely clear, but he definitely left a huge amount of magical knowledge and powerful necromantic artifacts behind. Some of these artifacts include Zutha's own weapons of choice, his multitude of magical rings, and the powerful Aeon stones which he employed. Many of these can still be found in the ruins of Xin-Grafar, though a few others might be in the possession of Count Varian Jaeger of Cheliax, based on the events of the Lord of Runes novel. Another artifact from the Rune Lord of Gluttony, which Tar-Baphon or his agents might seek to further their goals, is the Sword of Gluttony. The whereabouts of this sword are a bit unclear, as I can't tell yet if the Seven Swords of Sin adventure is canon anymore. If it is, the sword is probably in the possession of the Abadarian Church in Varisia. If not, the sword might reasonably be found anywhere in the former kingdom of Gastache. In addition to the sword itself, agents of the Whispering Way might be interested in finding the remains of its wielder, the barbarian Ungaroto, who is rumored to have been defeated sometime during the Ages of Darkness or Legend. Ungaroto was a tremendously powerful warrior, and if he wasn't fully destroyed, he would make an extremely powerful servant for Tar-Baphon or one of his lieutenants. Finally, the question of Tar-Baphon's soul cage is one which remains unanswered in the Age of Lost Omens, and this answer would prove tremendously valuable to both the Tyrant's own forces and their many enemies. Little is known about the Soul Cage, so it might be fun to run a story involving a hunt for some details on the location or nature of the cage itself. This might involve an investigation into Tar-Baphon's mysterious past. Tar-Baphon is known to have grown up in and around Ustalav as a prince or nobleman of Kelid descent. Beyond that, much of his backstory is functionally blank. This could present an opportunity for GMs to plant records of the young Tar-Baphon in some ancient ruins throughout the region, records which might hint at where the cage might be taken and what defenses might have been placed around it. This could kick off a high-stakes race between agents of the Whispering Way and a coalition of their enemies to hunt down the newly surfaced information and get it safely back to their home base. PCs on the side of evil might play the part of saboteurs, disrupting a mission from the Knights of Lastwall to secure such information. On the side of good, PCs might instead take on a role reminiscent of the crew of Rogue One from Star Wars, setting out on a doomed suicide mission to simply collect and pass on the information to their superiors, in hopes of creating some small chance at victory in the future. You could even do a Vader in the hallway scene, with the PCs handing off the information or completing a transference ritual just in time for them to die at the hands of Tar-Baphon himself. One potential location for these records might be the Kasnoriva Mages College in Ustalav, which Tar-Baphon personally ordered destroyed by the Marilith demon Kaltestrua. How to acquire the soul cage itself is another matter entirely. Like I mentioned earlier, rumors swirl that Urgathoa herself has hidden the cage in a place where even the gods are unable to find it. If those rumors are true, then the soul cage could very easily be in Abaddon, the Netherworld, or even the Void, all of which could make for interesting storytelling options. The option which stands out to me, however, is the Netherworld, and specifically Shadow Absalom, the dark mirror of Absalom which overlays the city at the center of the world in the plane of shadow. Given Tar-Baphon's connection to Eredin and the Starstone, I like the sort of thematic anti-parallel of placing Tar-Baphon's soul cage within a shadowy reflection of the Starstone Cathedral in Shadow Absalom. To my knowledge, no structure, which corresponds to the Starstone Cathedral in Shadow Absalom, has ever been detailed by Paizo, so it might be a great opportunity for GMs to test out their dungeon building skills, or to borrow liberally from high-level dungeons like 1E's Emerald Spire. As for how the soul cage might be destroyed, I do have a broad idea, even if Paizo hasn't released any official information. Tar-Baphon's soul cage is undoubtedly a tremendously powerful artifact. As such, it should have an appropriately convoluted means of destruction. My proposal is that it should have to be taken to the Cenotaph, the place where Tar-Baphon likely acquired the knowledge necessary to become a Lich in the first place. In such a place of necromantic power, the magics which ward the cage could be undone in a complex and time-consuming ritual, forcing the PCs and their allies to fend off waves of undead foes while the ritual is slowly completed. Once the wards around the soul cage have been removed, it would need to be destroyed by some weapon which shares a connection to the lingering power of Eredin, so the god of humanity might finish the job, and undo the damage his failed killing of Tar-Baphon caused thousands of years ago. The three weapons which come to mind in this regard are Heart's Edge, the sword of Iomide, the Halberd of Thace, which was crafted by Milani, who was herself a saint of Eredin, or the Aslanti Diamond, Eredin's own sword. The location of the Aslanti Diamond is entirely unknown, though hints to its location might be held by the Eredinite Church in Absalom, or within the dead god's collapsing divine realm near Axis. The Halberd of Thace might be acquired a bit more simply, by summoning Thace, the Herald of Caden-Kalian, and bargaining for the blade. Finally, Heart's Edge likely presents the best plot hook, as it is currently in the possession of Queen Abrogail II of House Thrune, and she is extremely unlikely to give it up willingly. The PCs getting their hands on Heart's Edge could very quickly spiral into a campaign all its own. Conclusion. I don't normally write conclusions for my videos, as I see myself as an informer first and foremost, rather than an interpreter. That said, I still have a few thoughts yet to share. First things first, I really can't emphasize just how powerful Tar-Baphon is, mechanically speaking. I've shown his 1E stat block here to try and convey it, since he hasn't yet been statted in 2nd edition. In addition to his absolutely incredible selection of spells and his frustratingly high spell DC relative to the mechanics of 1E, I would like to point out his aura of absolute terror, which paralyzes all those within his presence with no save. He also has the ability to animate corpses into zombies or skeletons with a touch, and there is no mechanical limit to the number of undead he can create or control. But, despite his incredible power, the Tyrant is plagued by a few serious flaws, both within himself and the organization he leads. Tar-Baphon suffers from possibly the most common character flaw among mythological characters: hubris. The Whispering Tyrant is among the most arrogant and self-important characters on all of Golarion. He sees himself as high above his rivals, and worthy of challenging even the gods themselves. At times, this has worked to his advantage, like his first confrontation with Aerodin resulting in his restoration as a Lich. More often, though, this arrogance prevents him from accurately assessing the danger presented to him by his enemies. His failure against General Arnazant and the Shining Crusade, for instance, was due in large part because he failed to treat them like the threat that they were. Additionally, this arrogance manifests as an inability to recognize faults and flaws in himself. After his imprisonment in Gallowspire, the tyrant raged for decades against those trapped with him, declaring that his defeat was their fault. This inability to recognize errors on his own part works to his detriment, as it largely prevents him from learning from his mistakes. On a less immediately detrimental note, the Whispering Tyrant often solves every immediate problem with an overwhelming and dramatic display of force. He could have used any number of ray spells or evocations to kill General Arnazant, but no, he had to use a wish spell, the mightiest spell in all of 1E, just because he could. When facing the heroes at the end of Tyrant's Grasp, he attacked them openly, throwing out another wish to open the fight, then attacking directly with everything he had. While he is undeniably intelligent, he seems to take a very direct approach to conflict when he is personally involved. While I have no problem with a simple and direct approach, I can't help feel like subtlety or trickery might have served him better at multiple points throughout his story. At the organizational level, the Whispering Way is regularly undermined by infighting. Broadly speaking, the tenets of the Way attract extremely self-interested and cruel people, who are motivated most often by the accumulation of personal power. This leads to strong rivalries between the adherents of the Way, which often result in murder or worse. This constant infighting and rivalry has hindered the operations of the Whispering Way on more than one occasion, to the point that it was a contributing factor in Tar-Baphon's defeat in the Cairnlands, which cost him a chance at divinity. Wow, that took a lot longer than I intended. I knew this topic was going to take a while, but this really got out of hand. But hey, that's it. That's the Whispering Tyrant, the biggest of the big bads on Golarion, as well as the cult which raised him to power. Tar-Baphon is functionally perfect as an unrepentant mustache-twirling villain. He is unquestionably evil, and his actions have earned him the enmity of nearly every major power in the Inner Sea region. And yet, his personal power is such that he can survive and even thrive in this incredibly hostile environment. His magical might is rivaled only by his cunning, ensuring that even the mightiest PCs can never be entirely sure that they have his number. Similarly, the Whispering Way is a great villainous organization from a narrative perspective. They are secretive, powerful, well-connected, and undeniably wicked. Everything you want in an antagonistic cult. In the next video, I'll be kicking off another themed month here at Pathfinder, though the theme this time is a regional pantheon, rather than an ancestral one. Now that I've had time to read through the new Tiansha sourcebooks, the time has come for me to cover some of the gods of the Dragon Empires. Up first is He Feng, the Duke of Thunder, patron deity of the Tengu, and, unironically, the most divorced man in the Great Beyond. And, on a personal note, this video was at the same time a blast and a nightmare to put together. This is easily the longest single document I have ever produced, and represents more than 100 hours of effort. I originally thought this video would come out to maybe an hour and a half, and feel a bit like my deep dive into Baba Yaga. Oh, how naive I was. This was the research project to end all research projects for this channel. I pulled from about 24 sourcebooks in total for this one, spread across both 1E and 2E material. I ended up putting together a 44-page Word doc containing most of my relevant notes and passages I wanted to reference. The script I'm reading right now clocked in at 50 pages, the longest I've ever written by a factor of 3. And now, all that work is complete. I can finally rest easy, knowing I've accomplished what I set out to do. I don't know that there's another singular topic out there that could demand this much from me. Tar-Baphon is the big bad of big bads on Golarion, like I said earlier. I might have made the comparison earlier in this video, but he really is the Sauron of the setting. There isn't really any one character whose history and legends loom quite so large. His story is the only one featured in not one, but 2 published APs. The only group that's in more than that are the Rune Lords, but treating them as a single topic would be... oh boy, that would be crazy. Just an outline for a script like that would probably be 40 plus pages, and the list of sourcebooks would be ridiculous. I'd need to read like 3 or 4 dozen sourcebooks from across 17 years of publication history. Actually, to be a bit more precise, it would be 46 sourcebooks and 1 novel. But don't worry about that. Don't ask how I know that.